Chapter 24 of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After 2 or 3 days, when I had established myself in my room, and had gone backwards and forwards to London several times, and I had ordered all I wanted of my tradesmen, Mr. Pocket and I had a long talk together. He knew more of my intended career than I knew myself, for he referred to his having been told by Mr. Jaggers that I was not designed for any profession, and that I should be well enough educated for my destiny if I could hold my own with the average of young men in prosperous circumstances. I acquiesced, of course, knowing nothing to the contrary. He advised my attending certain places in London for the acquisition of such mere rudiments as I wanted, and my investing him with the functions of explainer and director of all my studies. He hoped that with intelligent assistance I should meet with little to discourage me, and should soon be able to dispense with any aid but his. Through his way of saying this, and much more to similar purpose, he placed himself on confidential terms with me in an admirable manner, and I may state at once that he was always so zealous and honourable in fulfilling his compact with me, that he made me zealous and honourable in fulfilling mine with him. If he had shown indifference as a master, I have no doubt I should have returned the compliment as a pupil. He gave me no such excuse, and each of us did the other justice. Nor did I ever regard him as having anything ludicrous about him, or anything but what was serious, honest, and good in his tutor communication with me. When these points were settled, and so far carried out as that I had begun to work in earnest, it occurred to me that if I could retain my bedroom in Barnard's Inn, my life would be agreeably varied, while my manners would be none the worse for Herbert's society. Mr. Pocket did not object to this arrangement, but urged that before any step could possibly be taken in it, it must be submitted to my guardian. I felt that this delicacy arose out of the consideration that the plan would save Herbert some expense, so I went off to Little Britain and imparted my wish to Mr. Jaggers. "If I could buy the furniture now hired for me," said I, "and 1 or 2 other little things, I should be quite at home there." "Go it," said Mr. Jaggers, with a short laugh. "I told you you'd get on well. How much do you want?" I said I didn't know how much. "Come," retorted Mr. Jaggers, "how much? £50?" "Oh, not nearly so much. £5," said Mr. Jaggers. This was such a great fall that I said in discomfiture, "Oh, more than that." "More than that, eh?" retorted Mr. Jaggers, lying in wait for me, with his hands in his pockets, his head on one side, and his eyes on the wall behind me. "How much more?" "Well, it's so difficult to fix a sum," said I, hesitating. "Come," said Mr. Jaggers, "let's get at it. 2 × 5, will that do? 3 × 5, will that do? 4 × 5, will that do?" I said I thought that would do handsomely. 4 × 5 will do handsomely, will it?" said Mr. Jaggers, knitting his brows. "Now what do you make of 4 × 5? "What do I make of it? Ah," said Mr. Jaggers, "how much?" "I suppose you make it £20, said I, smiling. "Never mind what I make it, my friend," observed Mr. Jaggers, with a knowing and contradictory toss of his head. "I want to know what you make it." £20, of course." "Wemmick," said Mr. Jaggers, opening his office door, "take Mr. Pip's written order and pay him £20. This strongly marked way of doing business made a strongly marked impression on me, and that not of an agreeable kind. Mr. Jaggers never laughed, but he wore great bright creaking boots, and in poising himself on these boots, with his large head bent down, and his eyebrows joined together awaiting an answer, he sometimes caused the boots to creak, as if they laughed in a dry and suspicious way. And as he happened to go out now, and as Wemmick was brisk and talkative, I said to Wemmick that I hardly knew what to make of Mr. Jaggers' manner. "Tell him that, and he'll take it as a compliment," answered Wemmick. "He don't mean that you should know what to make of it." "Oh," for I looked surprised, "it's not personal, it's professional, only professional." Wemmick was at his desk, lunching and crunching on a dry hard biscuit, pieces of which he threw from time to time into his slit of a mouth, as if he were posting them. "Always seems to me," said Wemmick, "as if he had set a man-trap and was watching it. Suddenly, click, you're caught." Without remarking that man-traps were not among the amenities of life, I said I supposed he was very skilful. Deep, said Wemmick, as Australia, pointing with his pen at the office floor, to express that Australia was understood, for the purpose of the figure, to be symmetrically on the opposite spot of the globe. If there was anything deeper, added Wemmick, bringing his pen to paper, he'd be it. Then I said, I supposed he had a fine business, and Wemmick said, capital. And then I asked if there were many clerks, to which he replied, we don't run much to clerks, because there's only one Jaggers, and people won't have him as second hand. There are only 4 of us. Would you like to see 'em? You are one of us, as I may say. I accepted the offer. When Mr. Wemmick had put all the biscuit into the post, and he had paid me my money from a cash box in a safe, the key of which safe he kept somewhere down his back, and produced from his coat collar like an iron pigtail, we went upstairs. The house was dark and shabby, and the greasy shoulders that had left their mark in Mr. Jaggers's room seemed to have been shuffling up and down the staircase for years. In the front first floor, a clerk who looked something between a publican and a rat-catcher, a large, pale, puffed, swollen man, was attentively engaged with 3 or 4 people of shabby appearance, whom he treated as unceremoniously as everybody seemed to be treated who contributed to Mr. Jaggers's coffers. Getting evidence together, said Mr. Wemmick as we came out, for the bailey. In the room over that, a little flabby terrier of a clerk with dangling hair, his cropping seemed to have been forgotten when he was a puppy, was similarly engaged with a man with weak eyes, whom Mr. Wemmick presented to me as a smelter who kept his pot always boiling, and who would melt me anything I pleased, and who was in an excessive white perspiration, as if he had been trying his art on himself. In a back room, a high-shouldered man with a face-ache, tied up in a dirty flannel, who was dressed in old black clothes that bore the appearance of having been waxed, was stooping over his work of making fair copies of the notes of the other 2 gentlemen for Mr. Jaggers's own use. This was all the establishment. When we went downstairs again, Wemmick led me into my guardian's room and said, this you've seen already. Pray, said I, as the 2 odious casts with a twitchy leer upon them caught my sight again, whose likenesses are those? These, said Wemmick, getting upon a chair and blowing the dust off the horrible heads before bringing them down, these are 2 celebrated ones, famous clients of ours that got us a world of credit. This chap, why, you must have come down in the night and been peeping into the inkstand to get this blot upon your eyebrow, you old rascal. Murdered his master, and considering that he wasn't brought up to evidence, didn't plan it badly. Is it like him? I asked, recoiling from the brute as Wemmick spat upon his eyebrow and gave it a rub with his sleeve. Like him? It's himself, you know. The cast was made in Newgate, directly after he was taken down. You had a particular fancy for me, hadn't you, old Artful? Said Wemmick. He then explained this affectionate apostrophe by touching his brooch, representing the lady and the weeping willow at the tomb with the urn upon it, and saying, had it made for me express. Is the lady anybody? Said I. No, returned Wemmick, only his game. You liked your bit of game, didn't you? No, deuce a bit of a lady in the case, Mr. Pickwick, except one, and she wasn't of this slender ladylike sort, and you wouldn't have caught her looking after this urn, unless there was something to drink in it. Wemmick's attention thus directed to his brooch, and he put down the cast and polished the brooch with his pocket-handkerchief. Did that other creature come to the same end? I asked. He has the same look. You're right, said Wemmick. It's the genuine look, much as if one nostril was caught up with horsehair and a little fishhook. Yes, he came to the same end, quite the natural end here, I assure you. He forged wills, this blade did. If he didn't also put the supposed testators to sleep too. You were a gentlemanly cove, though. Mr. Wemmick was again apostrophising. And you said you could write Greek. Yah, Bounceable, what a liar you were. I never met such a liar as you. Before putting his late friend on the shelf again, Wemmick touched the largest of his mourning rings and said, sent out to buy it for me only the day before. While he was putting up the other cast and coming down from the chair, the thought crossed my mind that all his personal jewellery was derived from like sources, and as he had shown no diffidence on the subject, I ventured on the liberty of asking him the question when he stood before me dusting his hands. Oh, yes, he returned. These are all gifts of that kind. One brings another. You see, that's the way of it. I always takes them. They're curiosities, and they're property. They may not be worth much, but after all, they're property, and portable. It don't signify to you with your brilliant lookout. But as to myself, my guiding star always is, get hold of portable property. When I had rendered homage to this light, he went on to say in a friendly manner, if at any odd time, when you have nothing better to do, you wouldn't mind coming over to see me at Walworth, I could offer you a bed, and I should consider it an honour. I've not much to show you, but such 2 or 3 curiosities as I have got, you might like to look over, and I am fond of a bit of garden and a summer house. I said I should be delighted to accept his hospitality. Thank ye, said he. Then we'll consider that it's to come off when convenient to you. Have you dined with Mr. Jaggers yet? Not yet. Well, said Wemmick, he'll give you wine, and good wine. I'll give you punch, and not bad punch. And now I'll tell you something. When you go to dine with Mr. Jaggers, look at his housekeeper. Shall I see something very uncommon? Well, said Wemmick, you'll see a wild beast tamed. Not so very uncommon, you tell me. I reply, that depends on the wildness of the beast, and the amount of taming. It won't lower your opinion of Mr. Jaggers' powers. Keep your eye on it. I told him I would do so, with all the interest and curiosity that his preparation awakened. As I was taking my departure, he asked me if I would like to devote 5 minutes to seeing Mr. Jaggers at it. For several reasons, and not least because I didn't clearly know what Mr. Jaggers would be found at, I replied in the affirmative. We dived into the city and came up in a crowded police court, where a blood relation, in a murderous sense, of the deceased, with the fanciful taste in brooches, was standing at the bar, uncomfortably chewing something, while my guardian had a woman under examination or cross-examination, I don't know which, and was striking her and the bench and everybody present with awe. If anybody, of whatsoever degree, said a word that he didn't approve of, he instantly required to have it taken down. If anybody wouldn't make an admission, he said, I'll have it out of you. And if anybody made an admission, he said, now I've got you. The magistrate shivered under a single bite of his finger. Thieves and thief-takers hung in dread rapture on his words, and shrank when a hair of his eyebrows turned in their direction. Which side he was on I couldn't make out, for he seemed to me to be grinding the whole place in a mill. I only know that when I stole out on tiptoe he was not on the side of the bench, for he was making the legs of the old gentleman who presided quite convulsive under the table, by his denunciations of his conduct as the representative of British law and justice in that chair that day. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bentley Drummle, who was so sulky a fellow that he even took up a book as if its writer had done him an injury, did not take up an acquaintance in a more agreeable spirit. Heavy in figure, movement, and comprehension, in the sluggish complexion of his face, and in the large awkward tongue that seemed to loll about in his mouth as he himself lolled about in a room. He was idle, proud, niggardly, reserved, and suspicious. He came of rich people down in Somersetshire, who had nursed this combination of qualities until they made the discovery that it was just of age and a blockhead. Thus Bentley Drummle had come to Mr. Pocket when he was a head taller than that gentleman, and half a dozen heads thicker than most gentlemen. Startup had been spoiled by a weak mother, and kept at home when he ought to have been at school. But he was devotedly attached to her, and admired her beyond measure. He had a woman's delicacy of feature, and was, as you may see, though you never saw her, said Herbert to me, exactly like his mother. It was but natural that I should take to him much more kindly than to Drummle, and that even in the earliest evenings of our boating he and I should pull homeward abreast of one another, conversing from boat to boat, while Bentley Drummle came up in our wake, alone, under the overhanging banks and among the rushes. He would always creep inshore like some uncomfortable amphibious creature, even when the tide would have sent him fast upon his way. And I always think of him as coming after us in the dark or by the backwater, when our own 2 boats were breaking the sunset or the moonlight in mid-stream. Herbert was my intimate companion and friend. I presented him with half a share in my boat, which was the occasion of his often coming down to Hammersmith, and my possession of half a share in his chambers often took me up to London. We used to walk between the 2 places at all hours. I have an affection for the road yet, though it's not so pleasant a road as it was then, formed in the impressibility of untried youth and hope. When I had been in Mr. Pocket's family a month or two, Mr. and Mrs. Camilla turned up. Camilla was Mr. Pocket's sister. Georgiana, who I had seen at Miss Havisham's on the same occasion, also turned up. She was a cousin, an indigestive single woman, who called her rigidity religion and her liver love. These people hated me with the hatred of cupidity and disappointment. As a matter of course, they fawned upon me in my prosperity with the basest meanness. Towards Mr. Pocket, as a grown-up infant with no notion of his own interests, they showed the complacent forbearance I had heard them express. Mrs. Pocket they held in contempt, but they allowed the poor soul to have been heavily disappointed in life, because that she shed a feeble reflected light upon themselves. These were the surroundings among which I settled down, and applied myself to my education. I soon contracted expensive habits, and began to spend an amount of money that within a few short months I should have thought almost fabulous. But through good and evil I stuck to my books. There was no other merit in this than my having sense enough to feel my deficiencies. Between Mr. Pocket and Herbert I got on fast, and with one or the other always at my elbow to give me the start I wanted, and clear obstructions out of my road, I must have been as great a dolt as Drummle if I had done less. I had not seen Mr. Wemmick for some weeks, when I thought I would write him a note, and propose to go home with him on a certain evening. He replied that it would give him much pleasure, and that he would expect me at the office at 6 o'clock. Thither I went, and there I found him putting the key of his safe down his back as the clock struck. "Did you think of walking down to Walworth?" said he. "Certainly," said I, "if you approve." "Very much," was Wemmick's reply, "for I have had my legs under the desk all day, and should be glad to stretch them. Now I'll tell you what I've got for supper, Mr. Pip. I have got a stewed steak, which is of home preparation, and a cold roast fowl, which is from the cook's shop. I think it's tender, because the master of the shop was a juryman in some cases of ours the other day, and we let him down easy. I reminded him of it when I bought the fowl, and said, 'Pick us out a good one, old Briton, because if we had chosen to keep you in the box another day or two, we could easily have done it.' He said to that, 'Let me make you a present of the best fowl in the shop.' I let him, of course. As far as it goes, it's property and portable. You don't object to an aged parent, I hope?" I really thought he was still speaking of the fowl, until he added, "because I've got an aged parent at my place." I then said what politeness required. "So you haven't dined with Mr. Jaggers yet?" he pursued, as we walked along. "Not yet. He told me so this afternoon when he heard you were coming. I expect you'll have an invitation to-morrow. He's going to ask your pals too. 3 of 'em, ain't there?" Although I was not in the habit of counting Drummle as one of my intimate associates, I answered yes. "Well, he's going to ask the whole gang." I hardly felt complimented by the word. "And whatever he gives you, he'll give you good. Don't look forward to variety, but you'll have excellence. And there's another rum thing in his house," proceeded Wemmick, after a moment's pause, as if the remark followed on the housekeeper understood. "He never lets a door or a window be fastened at night." "Is he never robbed?" "That's it," returned Wemmick. "He says and gives it out publicly, 'I want to see the man who'll rob me.' Lord bless you, I've heard him 100 times, if I've heard him once, say to regular cracksmen in our front office, 'You know where I live. Now no bolt is ever drawn there. Why don't you do a stroke of business with me? Come, can't I tempt you?' Not a man of them, sir, would be bold enough to try it on for love or money." "They dread him so much?" said I. "Dread him," said Wemmick. "I believe you they dread him. Not but what he's artful, even in his defiance of them. No silver, sir. Britannia metal every spoon." "So they wouldn't have much," I observed, "even if they—" "Ah, but he would have much," said Wemmick, cutting me short, "and they know it. He'd have their lives, and the lives of scores of them. He'd have all he could get, and it's impossible to say what he couldn't get if he gave his mind to it." I was falling into meditation on my guardian's greatness, when Wemmick remarked, "As to the absence of plate, that's only his natural depth, you know. A river's its natural depth, and he's his natural depth. Look at his watch chain. That's real enough." "Is it very massive?" said I. "Massive!" repeated Wemmick. "I think so. and his watch is a gold repeater and worth £100 if it's worth a penny. Mr. Pip, there are about 700 thieves in this town who know all about that watch. There's not a man, a woman, or a child among them who wouldn't identify the smallest link in that chain, and drop it as if it was red hot, if inveigled into touching it. At first, with such discourse, and afterwards with conversation of a more general nature, did Mr. Wemmick and I beguile the time and the road, until he gave me to understand that we had arrived in the district of Walworth. It appeared to be a collection of back lanes, ditches, and little gardens, and to present the aspect of a rather dull retirement. Wemmick's house was a little wooden cottage in the midst of plots of garden, and the top of it was cut out and painted like a battery mounted with guns. "My own doing," said Wemmick. "Looks pretty, doesn't it?" I highly commended it. I think it was the smallest house I ever saw, with the queerest Gothic windows, by far the greater part of them sham, and a Gothic door almost too small to get in at. "That's a real flagstaff, you see," said Wemmick, "and on Sundays I run up a real flag. Then look here, after I have crossed this bridge I hoist it up so, and cut off the communication." The bridge was a plank, and it crossed a chasm about 4 feet wide and 2 deep, but it was very pleasant to see the pride with which he hoisted it up and made it fast, smiling as he did so, with a relish, not merely mechanically. "At 9 o'clock every night, Greenwich time," said Wemmick, "the gun fires. There he is, you see, and when you hear him go, I think you'll say he's a stinger." The piece of ordnance he referred to was mounted in a separate fortress, constructed of lattice work. It was protected from the weather by an ingenious little tarpaulin contrivance in the nature of an umbrella. "Then at the back," said Wemmick, "out of sight, so as not to impede the idea of fortifications, for it's a principle with me, if you have an idea, carry it out and keep it up. I don't know whether that's your opinion." I said decidedly, "At the back there's a pig, and there are fowls and rabbits. Then I knock together my own little frame, you see, and grow cucumbers, and you'll judge at supper what sort of a salad I can raise." "So, sir," said Wemmick, smiling again, but seriously too, as he shook his head, "if you can suppose the little place besieged, it would hold out a devil of a time in a point of provisions." Then he conducted me to a bower about a dozen yards off, but which was approached by such ingenious twists of path that it took quite a long time to get at, and in this retreat our glasses were already set forth. Our punch was cooling in an ornamental lake, on whose margin the bower was raised. This piece of water, with an island in the middle which might have been the salad for supper, was of a circular form, and he had constructed a fountain in it, which, when you set a little mill going and took a cork out of a pipe, played to that powerful extent that it made the back of your hand quite wet. "I am my own engineer, and my own carpenter, and my own plumber, and my own gardener, my own jack of all trades," said Wemmick, in acknowledging my compliments. "Well, it's a good thing, you know. It brushes the Newgate cobwebs away, and pleases the aged. You wouldn't mind being at once introduced to the aged, would you? It wouldn't put you out?" I expressed the readiness I felt, and we went into the castle. There we found, sitting by the fire, a very old man in a flannel coat, clean, cheerful, comfortable, and well cared for, but intensely deaf. "Well, aged parent," said Wemmick, shaking hands with him in a cordial and jocose way, "how am you?" "All right, John, all right," replied the old man. "Here's Mr. Pip, aged parent," said Wemmick, "and I wish you could hear his name. Nod away at him, Mr. Pip. That's what he likes. Nod away at him, if you please, like winking." "This is a fine place of my son's, sir," cried the old man, while I nodded as hard as I possibly could. "This is a pretty pleasure ground, sir. This spot and these beautiful works upon it ought to be kept together by the nation after my son's time for the people's enjoyment. You're as proud of it as Punch, ain't you, aged?" said Wemmick, contemplating the old man with his hard face really softened. "There's a nod for you, giving him a tremendous one. There's another for you, giving him a still more tremendous one. You like that, don't you, if you're not tired? Mr. Pip, though I know it's tiring to strangers, will you tip him one more? You can't think how it pleases him." I tipped him several more, and he was in great spirits. We left him bestirring himself to feed the fowls, and we sat down to our punch in the arbour, where Wemmick told me, as he smoked a pipe, that it had taken him a good many years to bring the property up to its present pitch of perfection. "Is it your own, Mr. Wemmick?" "Oh, yes," said Wemmick. "I have got hold of it, a bit at a time. It's a freehold, by George." "Is it indeed? I hope Mr. Jaggers admires it." "Never seen it," said Wemmick. "Never heard of it. Never seen the aged. Never heard of him. No, the office is one thing, and private life is another. When I go into the office, I leave the castle behind me, and when I come into the castle, I leave the office behind me. If it's not in any way disagreeable to you, you'll oblige me by doing the same. I don't wish it professionally spoken about." Of course I felt my good faith involved in the observance of his request. Punch being very nice, we sat there drinking it and talking until it was almost 9 o'clock. "Getting near gunfire," said Wemmick, and then, as he laid down his pipe, "It's the aged's treat." Proceeding into the castle again, we found the aged heating the poker, with expectant eyes, as a preliminary to the performance of this great nightly ceremony. Wemmick stood with his watch in his hand until the moment was come for him to take the red-hot poker from the aged and repair to the battery. He took it and went out, and presently the stinger went off with a bang that shook the crazy little box of a cottage as if it must fall to pieces, and made every glass and teacup in it ring. Upon this the aged, who I believe would have been blown out of his armchair but for holding on by the elbows, cried out exultingly, "He's fired! I heard him!" And I nodded at the old gentleman until it is no figure of speech to declare that I absolutely could not see him. The interval between that time and supper Wemmick devoted to showing me his collection of curiosities. They were mostly of a felonious character, comprising the pen with which a celebrated forgery had been committed, a distinguished razor or two, some locks of hair, and several manuscript confessions written under condemnation, upon which Mr. Wemmick set particular value as being, to use his own words, "every one of 'em lies, sir." These were agreeably dispersed among small specimens of china and glass, various neat trifles made by the proprietor of the museum, and some tobacco stoppers carved by the aged. They were all displayed in that chamber of the castle to which I had been first inducted, and which served not only as the general sitting room, but as the kitchen too, if I might judge from a saucepan on the hob and a brazen bijou over the fireplace, designed for the suspension of a roasting jack. There was a neat little girl in attendance, who looked after the aged in the day. When she had laid the supper cloth, the bridge was lowered to give her a means of egress, and she withdrew for the night. The supper was excellent, and though the castle was rather subject to dry rot, insomuch that it tasted like a bad nut, and although the pig might have been further off, I was heartily pleased with my whole entertainment. Nor was there any drawback on my little turret bedroom, beyond there being such a very thin ceiling between me and the flagstaff, that when I lay down on my back in bed, it seemed as if I had to balance that pole on my forehead all night. Wemmick was up early in the morning, and I am afraid I heard him cleaning my boots. After that he fell to gardening, and I saw him from my Gothic window, pretending to employ the aged, and nodding at him in a most devoted manner. Our breakfast was as good as the supper, and at 8:30 precisely we started for Little Britain. By degrees Wemmick got drier and harder as we went along, and his mouth tightened into a post office again. At last, when we got to his place of business, and he pulled out his key from his coat collar, he looked as unconscious of his Walworth property as if the castle and the drawbridge and the arbour and the lake and the fountain and the aged had all been blown into space together by the last discharge of the stinger. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It fell out, as Wemmick had told me it would, that I had an early opportunity of comparing my guardian's establishment with that of his cashier and clerk. My guardian was in his room, washing his hands with his scented soap, when I went into the office from Walworth, and he called me to him, and gave me the invitation for myself and friends which Wemmick had prepared me to receive. No ceremony, he stipulated, and no dinner dress, and say to-morrow. I asked him where we should come to, for I had no idea where he lived, and I believe it was in his general objection to make anything like an admission that he replied, "Come here, and I'll take you home with me." I embraced this opportunity of remarking that he washed his clients off as if he were a surgeon or a dentist. He had a closet in his room, fitted up for the purpose, which smelt of the scented soap like a perfumer's shop. It had an unusually large jack-towel on a roller inside the door, and he would wash his hands and wipe them and dry them all over this towel whenever he came in from a police court or dismissed a client from his room. When I and my friends repaired to him at 6 o'clock next day, he seemed to have been engaged on a case of a darker complexion than usual, for we found him with his head butted into this closet, not only washing his hands, but laving his face and gargling his throat. And even when he had done all that, and had gone all round the jack-towel, he took out his penknife and scraped the case out of his nails before he put his coat on. There were some people slinking about as usual when we passed out into the street, who were evidently anxious to speak with him, but there was something so conclusive in the halo of scented soap which encircled his presence, that they gave it up for that day. As we walked along westward, he was recognized ever and again by some face in the crowd off the streets, and whenever that happened he talked louder to me, but he never otherwise recognized anybody, or took notice that anybody recognized him. He conducted us to Gerrard Street, Soho, to a house on the south side of that street, rather a stately house of its kind, but dolefully in want of painting, and with dirty windows. He took out his key and opened the door, and we all went into a stone hall, bare, gloomy, and little used. So up a dark brown staircase into a series of 3 dark brown rooms on the first floor. There were carved garlands on the panelled walls, and as he stood among them, giving us welcome, I know what kind of loops I thought they looked like. Dinner was laid in the best of these rooms. The second was his dressing-room, the third his bedroom. He told us that he held the whole house, but rarely used more of it than we saw. The table was comfortably laid. No silver in the service, of course, and at the side of his chair was a capacious dumb waiter, with a variety of bottles and decanters on it, and 4 dishes of fruit for dessert. I noticed throughout that he kept everything under his own hand, and distributed everything himself. There was a bookcase in the room. I saw from the backs of the books that they were about evidence of criminal law, criminal biography, trials, acts of Parliament, and such things. The furniture was all very solid and good, like his watch-chain. It had an official look, however, and there was nothing merely ornamental to be seen. In the corner was a little table of papers with a shaded lamp, so that he seemed to bring the office home with him in that respect too, and to wheel it out of an evening and fall to work. As he had scarcely seen my 3 companions until now, for he and I had walked together, he stood on the hearthrug after ringing the bell, and took a searching look at them. To my surprise, he seemed at once to be principally, if not solely, interested in Drummle. "Pip," said he, putting his large hand on my shoulder and moving me to the window, "I don't know one from the other. Who's the Spider?" "The Spider?" said I. "The blotchy, sprawly, sulky fellow." "That's Bentley Drummle," I replied. "The one with the delicate face is Startop." Not making the least account of the one with the delicate face, he returned, "Bentley Drummle is his name, is it? I like the look of that fellow." He immediately began to talk to Drummle, not at all deterred by his replying in his heavy, reticent way, but apparently led on by it to screw discourse out of him. I was looking at the two, when there came between me and them the housekeeper, with the first dish for the table. She was a woman of about 40, I supposed, but I may have thought her younger than she was. Rather tall, of a lithe, nimble figure, extremely pale, with large faded eyes, and a quantity of streaming hair. I cannot say whether any diseased affection of the heart caused her lips to be parted as if she were panting, and her face to bear a curious expression of suddenness and flutter, but I know that I had been to see Macbeth at the theatre a night or 2 before, and that her face looked to me as if it were all disturbed by a fiery air, like the faces I had seen rise out of the witch's cauldron. She set the dish on, touched my guardian quietly on the arm with a finger to notify that the dinner was ready, and vanished. We took our seats at the round table, and my guardian kept Drummle on one side of him, while Startop sat on the other. It was a noble dish of fish that the housekeeper had put on the table,
and we had a joint of equally choice mutton afterwards, and then an equally choice bird, sauces, wines, all the accessories we wanted, and all of the best, were given out by our host from his dumb waiter, and when they had made the circuit of the table, he always put them back again. Similarly, he dealt us clean plates and knives and forks for each course, and dropped those just disused into 2 baskets on the ground by his chair. No other attendant than the housekeeper appeared. She set on every dish, and I always saw in her face a face rising out of the cauldron. Years afterwards I made a dreadful likeness of that woman, by causing a face that had no other natural resemblance to it than it derived from flowing hair to pass behind a bowl of flaming spirits in a dark room. Induced to take particular notice of the housekeeper, both by her own striking appearance and by Wemmick's preparation, I observed that whenever she was in the room she kept her eyes attentively on my guardian, and that she would remove her hands from any dish she put before him hesitatingly, as if she dreaded calling her back, and wanted him to speak when she was nigh, if he had anything to say. I fancied I could detect in his manner a consciousness of this, and a purpose of always holding her in suspense. Dinner went off gaily, and although my guardian seemed to follow rather than originate subjects, I knew that he wrenched the weakest part of our dispositions out of us. For myself, I found that I was expressing my tendency to lavish expenditure, and to patronize Herbert, and to boast of my great prospects, before I quite knew that I had opened my lips. It was so with all of us, but with no one more than Drummle, the development of whose inclination to gird in a grudging and suspicious way at the rest was screwed out of him before the fish was taken off. It was not then, but when we had got to the cheese, that our conversation turned upon our rowing feats, and that Drummle was rallied for coming up behind of a night in that slow amphibious way of his. Drummle, upon this, informed our host that he much preferred our room to our company, and that as to skill he was more than our master, and that as to strength he could scatter us like chaff. By some invisible agency my guardian wound him up to a pitch little short of ferocity about this trifle, and he fell to bearing and spanning his arm to show how muscular it was, and we all fell to bearing and spanning our arms in a ridiculous manner. Now the housekeeper was at that time clearing the table, my guardian, taking no heed of her, but with the side of his face turned from her, was leaning back in his chair, biting the side of his forefinger, and showing an interest in Drummle that to me was quite inexplicable. Suddenly he clapped his large hand on the housekeeper's like a trap, as she stretched it across the table. So suddenly and smartly did he do this, that we all stopped in our foolish contention. "If you talk of strength," said Mr. Jaggers, "I'll show you a wrist. Molly, let them see your wrist." Her entrapped hand was on the table, but she had already put her other hand behind her waist. "Master," she said in a low voice, with her eyes attentively and entreatingly fixed upon him, "don't." "I'll show you a wrist," repeated Mr. Jaggers, with an immovable determination to show it. "Molly, let them see your wrist." "Master," she again murmured, "please." "Molly," said Mr. Jaggers, not looking at her, but obstinately looking at the opposite side of the room, "let them see both your wrist. Show them. Come." He took his hand from hers and turned that wrist up on the table. She brought her other hand from behind her and held the two out side by side. The last wrist was much disfigured, deeply scarred, and scarred across and across. When she held her hands out, she took her eyes from Mr. Jaggers and turned them watchfully on every one of the rest of us in succession. "There's power here," said Mr. Jaggers coolly, tracing the sinews with his forefinger. "Very few men have the power of wrist that this woman has. It's remarkable what mere force of grip there is in these hands. I have had occasion to notice many hands, but never saw stronger in that respect, man's or woman's, than these." While he said these words in a leisurely, critical style, she continued to look at every one of us in regular succession as we sat. The moment he ceased, she looked at him again. "That'll do, Molly," said Mr. Jaggers, giving her a slight nod. "You have been admired, and can go." She withdrew her hands and went out of the room, and Mr. Jaggers, putting the decanters on from his dumb waiter, filled his glass, and passed round the wine. "At 9:30, gentlemen," said he, "we must break up. Pray make the best use of your time. I am glad to see you all. Mr. Drummle, I drink to you." If his object in singling out Drummle were to bring him out still more, it perfectly succeeded. In a sulky triumph, Drummle showed his morose depreciation of the rest of us in a more and more offensive degree, until he became downright intolerable. Through all his stages Mr. Jaggers followed him with the same strange interest. He actually seemed to serve as a zest to Mr. Jaggers' wine. In our boyish want of discretion, I dare say we took too much to drink, and I know we talked too much. We became particularly hot upon some boorish sneer of Drummle's, to the effect that we were too free with our money. It led to my remarking, with more zeal than discretion, that it came with a bad grace from him, to whom Startop had lent money in my presence but a week or so before. "Well," retorted Drummle, "he'll be paid." "I don't mean to imply that he won't," said I, "but it might make you hold your tongue about us and our money, I should think." "You should think!" retorted Drummle. "Oh, Lord!" "I dare say," I went on, meaning to be very severe, "that he wouldn't lend money to any of us if we wanted it." "You are right," said Drummle. "I wouldn't lend one of you a sixpence. I wouldn't lend anybody a sixpence." "Rather mean to borrow under those circumstances, I should say." "You should say!" repeated Drummle. "Oh, Lord!" This was so very aggravating, the more especially as I found myself making no way against his surly obtuseness, that I said, disregarding Herbert's efforts to check me, "Come, Mr. Drummle, since we are on the subject, I'll tell you what passed between Herbert here and me when you borrowed that money." "I don't want to know what passed between Herbert there and you," growled Drummle, and I think he added in a lower growl that we might both go to the devil and shake ourselves. "I'll tell you, however," said I, "whether you want to know or not. We said that as you put it in your pocket, very glad to get it, you seemed to be immensely amused at his being so weak as to lend it." Drummle laughed outright, and sat laughing in our faces with his hands in his pockets and his round shoulders raised, plainly signifying that it was quite true, and that he despised us as asses all. Hereupon Startop took him in hand, though with a much better grace than I had shown, and exhorted him to be a little more agreeable. Startop being a lively, bright young fellow, and Drummle being the exact opposite, the latter was always disposed to resent him as a direct personal affront. He now retorted in a coarse, lumpish way, and Startup tried to turn the discussion aside with some small pleasantry that made us all laugh. Resenting this little success more than anything, Drummle, without any threat or warning, pulled his hands out of his pockets, dropped his round shoulders, swore, took up a large glass, and would have flung it at his adversary's head but for our entertainers dexterously seizing it at the instant when it was raised for that purpose. "Gentlemen," said Mr. Jaggers, deliberately putting down the glass and hauling out his gold repeater by its massive chain, "I am exceedingly sorry to announce that it's 9:30. On this hint we all rose to depart. Before we got to the street door, Startup was cheerily calling Drummle "old boy," as if nothing had happened, but the old boy was so far from responding that he would not even walk to Hammersmith on the same side of the way. So Herbert and I, who remained in town, saw them going down the street on opposite sides, Startup leading and Drummle lagging behind in the shadow of the houses, much as he was wont to follow in his boat. As the door was not yet shut, I thought I would leave Herbert there for a moment, and run up the stairs again to say a word to my guardian. I found him in his dressing room, surrounded by his stock of boots, already hard at it, washing his hands of us. I told him I had come up again to say how sorry I was that anything disagreeable should have occurred, and that I hoped that he would not blame me much. "Pooh!" said he, sluicing his face, and speaking through the water drops. "It is nothing, Pip. I like that spider, though." He had turned towards me now, and was shaking his head, and blowing and towelling himself. "No, no," my guardian assented. "Don't have too much to do with him. Keep as clear of him as you can. But I like the fellow, Pip. He is one of the true sort. Why, if I was a fortune teller—" Looking out of the towel, he caught my eye. "But I am not a fortune teller," he said, letting his head drop into a festoon of towel, and toweling away at his 2 ears. "You know what I am, don't you? Good night, Pip." "Good night, sir." In about a month after that, the Spider's time with Mr. Pocket was up for good, and to the great relief of all the house but Mrs. Pocket, he went home to the family hole. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My dear Mr. Pip, I write this by request of Mr. Gargery, for to let you know that he is going to London in company with Mr. Wopsle, and would be glad, if agreeable, to be allowed to see you. He would call at Barnard's Hotel Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, when, if not agreeable, please leave word. Your poor sister is much the same as when you left. We talk of you in the kitchen every night, and wonder what you are saying and doing. If now considered in the light of a liberty, excuse it for the love of poor old days. No more, dear Mr. Pip, from your ever obliged and affectionate servant, Biddy. P.S. He wishes me most particular to write what larks. He says you will understand. I hope and do not doubt it will be agreeable to see him, even though a gentleman, for you had ever a good heart, and he is a worthy, worthy man. I have read him all, excepting only the last little sentence, and he wishes me most particular to write again, what larks. I received this letter by the post on Monday morning, and therefore its appointment was for next day. Let me confess exactly with what feelings I look forward to Joe's coming. Not with pleasure, though I was bound to see him by so many ties. No, with considerable disturbance, some mortification, and a keen sense of incongruity. If I could have kept him away by paying money, I certainly would have paid money. My greatest reassurance was that he was coming to Barnard's Inn, and not to Hammersmith, and consequently would not fall in Bentley Drummle's way. I had little objection to his being seen by Herbert or his father, for both of whom I had a respect, but I had the sharpest sensitiveness as to his being seen by Drummle, whom I held in contempt. So throughout life our worst weaknesses and meannesses are usually committed for the sake of the people whom we most despise. I had begun to be always decorating the chambers in some quite unnecessary and inappropriate way or another, and very expensive those wrestles with Barnard proved to be. By this time the rooms were vastly different from what I had found them, and I enjoyed the honour of occupying a few prominent pages in the books of a neighbouring upholsterer. I had got on so fast of late that I had even started a boy in boots, top boots, in bondage and slavery, to whom I might have been said to pass my days. For after I had made the monster, out of the refuse of my washerwoman's family, and had clothed him with a blue coat, canary waistcoat, white cravat, creamy breeches, and the boots already mentioned, I had to find him a little to do, and a great deal to eat, and with both of these horrible requirements he haunted my existence. This avenging phantom was ordered to be on duty at 8 on Tuesday morning in the hall. It was 2 feet square, as charged for floorcloth, and Herbert suggested certain things for breakfast that he thought Joe would like. While I felt sincerely obliged to him for being so interested and considerate, I had an odd half-provoked sense of suspicion upon me that if Joe had been coming to see him, he wouldn't have been quite so brisk about it. However, I came into town on the Monday night to be ready for Joe, and I got up early in the morning and caused the sitting-room and breakfast table to assume their most splendid appearance. Unfortunately the morning was drizzly, and an angel could not have concealed the fact that Barnard was shedding sooty tears outside the window, like some weak giant of a sweep. As the time approached, I should have liked to have run away, but the avenger, pursuant to orders, was in the hall, and presently I heard Joe on the staircase. I knew it was Joe by his clumsy manner of coming up the stairs, his state boots being always too big for him, and by the time it took him to read the names on the other floors in the course of his ascent. When at last he stopped outside our door, I could hear his finger tracing over the painted letters of my name, and afterwards I distinctly heard him breathing in at the keyhole. Finally he gave a faint single rap, and Pepper, such was the compromising name of the avenging boy, announced, "Mr. Gargery."
I thought he never would have done wiping his feet, and that I must have gone out to lift him off the mat. But at last he came in. Joe! Joe! How are you, Joe? Pip! How are you, Pip? With his good honest face all glowing and shining, and his hat pulled down on the floor between us, he caught both my hands and worked them straight up and down, as if I had been the last patented pump. "I'm glad to see you, Joe. Give me your hat." But Joe, taking it up carefully with both hands like a bird's nest with eggs in it, wouldn't hear of parting with that piece of property, and persisted in standing talking over it in a most uncomfortable way. "Which that you have growed," said Joe, "and that swelled, and that gentle folked." Joe considered a little before he discovered this word. "As to be sure you are an honour to your king and country. And you, Joe, look wonderfully well." "Thank God," said Joe. "I'm merciful to most. And your sister, she's no worse than she were. And Biddy, she's ever right and ready. And old friends is no back at her, if not no for'ard her, 'ceptin Wopsle, and he's had a drop." At this time, still with both hands taking great care of the bird's nest, Joe was rolling his eyes round and round the room, and round the flowered pattern of my dressing gown. "Had a drop, Joe?" "Why, yes," said Joe, lowering his voice. "He's left the church and went into the play acting, which play acting have likewise brought him to London along with me. And his wish were," said Joe, getting the bird's nest under his left arm for the moment, and groping in it for an egg with his right, "if no offence, as I wouldn't you that." I took what Joe gave me, and I found it to be the crumpled playbill of a small metropolitan theatre, announcing the first appearance in that very week of the celebrated provincial amateur of Roscian renown, whose unique performance in the highest tragic walk of our national bard has lately occasioned so great a sensation in local dramatic circles. "Were you at his performance, Joe?" I inquired. "I were," said Joe, with emphasis and solemnity. "Was there a great sensation?" "Why," said Joe, "yes, there certainly were a peck of orange peel, particular when he see the ghost. Though I put it to yourself, sir, whether it were calculated to keep a man up to his work with a good heart, to be continually cutting in and betwixt him and the ghost with amen. A man may have had a misfortune and been in the church," said Joe, lowering his voice to an argumentative and feeling tone, "but that's no reason why you should put him out at such a time. Which I mean to say, if the ghost of a man's own father cannot be allowed to claim his attention, what can, sir? Still more, when his mourning at his unfortunately made so small is that the weight of the black feathers brings it off, try to keep it on how you may." A ghost-seeing effect in Joe's own countenance informed me that Herbert had entered the room. So I presented Joe to Herbert, who held out his hand, but Joe backed from it and held on by the bird's nest. "Your servant, sir," said Joe, "which I hope as you and Pip," here his eye fell on the Avenger, who was putting some toast on the table, and so plainly denoted an intention to make that young gentleman one of the family that I frowned it down and confused him more. "I mean to say, you two gentlemen, which I hope as you get your healths in this close spot, for the present may be a wery good inn, according to London opinions," said Joe confidentially, "and I believe its character do stand. But I wouldn't keep a pig in it myself, not in the case that I wished him to fatten wholesome and eat with a meller flavour on him." Having borne this flattering testimony to the merits of our dwelling place, and having incidentally shown this tendency to call me sir, Joe, being invited to sit down to table, looked all round the room for a suitable spot on which to deposit his hat, as if it were only on some very few rare substances in nature that it could find a resting place, and ultimately stood it on an extreme corner of the chimney-piece, from which it ever afterwards fell off at intervals. "Do you take tea or coffee, Mr. Gargery?" asked Herbert, who always presided of a morning. "Thank'ee, sir," said Joe, stiff from head to foot. "I'll take whichever is most agreeable to yourself. What do you say to coffee?" "Thank'ee, sir," returned Joe, evidently dispirited by the proposal. "Since you are so kind as to make choice of coffee, I will not run contrary to your own opinions. But don't you never find it a little eating?" "Say tea, then," said Herbert, pouring it out. Here Joe's hat tumbled off the mantelpiece, and he started out of his chair and picked it up, and fitted it to the same exact spot, as if it were an absolute point of good breeding that it should tumble off again soon. "When did you come to town, Mr. Gargery?" "Were it yesterday afternoon?" said Joe, after coughing behind his hand, as if he had had time to catch the whooping cough since he came. "No, it were not. Yes, it were. Yes, it were. Yesterday afternoon," with the appearance of mingled wisdom, relief, and strict impartiality. "Have you seen anything of London yet?" "Why, yes, sir," said Joe. "Me and Wopsle went off straight to look at the blacking ware'us, but we didn't find that it come up to its likeness in the red bills at the shop doors, which I mean to say," added Joe in an explanatory manner, "as it is there drawed too architectural." I believe Joe would have prolonged this word, mighty expressive to my mind of some architecture that I know, into a perfect chorus, but for his attention being providentially attracted by his hat, which was toppling. Indeed, it demanded from him a constant attention, and a quickness of eye and hand, very like that exacted by wicket-keeping. He made extraordinary play with it, and showed the greatest skill, now rushing at it and catching it neatly as it dropped, now merely stopping it midway, beating it up, and humouring it in various parts of the room and against a good deal of the pattern of the paper on the wall, before he felt safe to close with it, finally splashing it into the slop-basin, where I took the liberty of laying hands upon it. As to his shirt-collar and coat-collar, they were perplexing to reflect upon. Insoluble mysteries both. Why should a man scrape himself to that extent before he consider himself full dressed? Why should he suppose it necessary to be purified by suffering for his holiday clothes? Then he fell into such unaccountable fits of meditation, with his fork midway between his plate and his mouth, had his eyes attracted in such strange directions, was afflicted with such remarkable coughs, sat so far from the table, and dropped so much more than he ate, and pretended that he hadn't dropped it, that I was heartily glad when Herbert left us for the city. I had neither the good sense nor the good feeling to know this was all my fault, and that if I had been easier with Joe, Joe would have been easier with me. I felt impatient of him, and out of temper with him, in which condition he heaped coals of fire upon my head. "Us two being now alone, sir," began Joe. "Joe," I interrupted pettishly, "how can you call me sir?" Joe looked at me for a single instant with something faintly like reproach. Utterly preposterous as his cravat was, and as his collars were, I was conscious of a sort of dignity in the look. "Us two being now alone," resumed Joe, "and me having the intentions and abilities to stay not many minutes more, I will now conclude, leastways begin, to mention what I have led to my having the present honour. For it was not," said Joe, with his old air of lucid exposition, "that my only wish were to be useful to you. I should not have had the honour of breaking wittles in the company and abode of gentlemen." I was so unwilling to see the look again, that I made no remonstrance against this tone. "Well, sir," pursued Joe, "this is how it were. I were at the Bargeman t'other night, Pip." Whenever he subsided into affection, he called me Pip, and whenever he relapsed into politeness, he called me sir. "When there came up in his shay-cart, Pumblechook, which that same identical," said Joe, going down a new track, "do comb my hair the wrong way, sometimes awful, by giving it up and down town, as it were him which ever had your infant companionation, and were looked upon as a playfellow by yourself." "Nonsense, it was you, Joe." "Which I fully believed it were, Pip," said Joe, slightly tossing his head, "though it signify little now, sir." "Well, Pip, this same identical, which his manners is given to blusterous, came to me at the Bargeman. What a pipe and a pint of beer do give refreshment to the working man, sir, and do not over-stimilate. And his word were, 'Joseph, Miss Havisham, she wished to speak to you.'" "Miss Havisham, Joe?" "She wish," were Pumblechook's word, "to speak to you." Joe sat and rolled his eyes at the ceiling. "Yes, Joe, go on, please." "Next day, sir," said Joe, looking at me as if I were a long way off, "having cleaned myself, I go and see Miss A." "Miss A, Joe? Miss Havisham?" "Which I say, sir," replied Joe, with an air of legal formality, as if he were making his will. "Miss A, or otherwise Havisham. Her expression air then as follering: 'Mr. Gargery, you are in correspondence with Mr. Pip?' Having had a letter from you, I were able to say I am. When I married your sister, sir, I said I will, and when I answered your friend Pip, I said I am. Would you tell him then, said she, that which Estella has come home and would be glad to see him? I felt my face fire up as I looked at Joe. I hope one remote cause of its firing might have been my consciousness that if I had known his errand I should have given him more encouragement. Biddy, pursued Joe, when I got home and asked for her to write the message to you, a little hung back. Biddy says, I know you would be very glad to have it by word of mouth. It is holiday time. You want to go and see him. Go. I have now concluded, sir, said Joe, rising from his chair. And Pip, I wish you ever well and ever prospering to a greater and greater height. But you're not going now, Joe. Yes, I am, said Joe. But you are coming back to dinner, Joe. No, I'm not, said Joe. Our eyes met, and all the sir melted out of that manly heart as he gave me his hand. Pip, dear old chap, life is made of ever so many partings welded together, as I may say, and one man's a blacksmith, and one's a whitesmith, and one's a goldsmith, and one's a coppersmith. Divisions amongst such must come, and must be met as they come. If there's being any fault at all today, it's mine. You and me is not two figures to be together in London, not yet anywheres else but what is private and beknown, and understood among friends. It ain't that I'm proud, but that I want to be right, as you shall never see me no more in these clothes. I'm wrong in these clothes. I'm wrong out of the forge, the kitchen, or off the meshes. You won't find half so much fault in me if you think of me in my forge dress, with my hammer in my hand, or even my pipe. You won't find half so much fault in me if, supposing as you should ever wish to see me, you come and put your head in at the forge window and see Joe the blacksmith, there at the old anvil in the old burnt apron, sticking to the old work. I'm awful dull, but I hope I've beat out something nigh the rights of this at last, and so God bless you, dear old Pip, old chap, God bless you. I had not been mistaken in my fancy that there was a simple dignity in him. The fashion of his dress could no more come in its way when he spoke these words than it could come in its way in heaven. He touched me gently on the forehead and went out. As soon as I could recover myself sufficiently, I hurried out after him and looked for him in the neighbouring streets. But he was gone. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was clear that I must repair to our town next day, and in the first flow of my repentance it was equally clear that I must stay at Joe's. But when I had secured my box place by tomorrow's coach, and had been down to Mr. Pocket's and back, I was not by any means convinced on the last point, and began to invent reasons and make excuses for putting up at the Blue Boar. I should be an inconvenience at Joe's. I was not expected, and my bed would not be ready. I should be too far from Miss Havisham's, and she was exacting and mightn't like it. All other swindlers upon earth, and nothing to the self-swindlers, and with such pretences did I cheat myself. Surely a curious thing that I should innocently take a bad half-crown of somebody else's manufacture is reasonable enough, but that I should knowingly reckon the spurious coin of my own make as good money, an obliging stranger, under pretence of compactly folding up my bank-notes for security's sake, abstracts the notes and gives me nutshells. But what is his sleight of hand to mine, when I fold up my own nutshells and pass them on myself as notes? Having settled that I must go to the Blue Boar, my mind was much disturbed by indecision whether or not to take the Avenger. It was tempting to think of that expensive mercenary publicly airing his boots in the archway of the Blue Boar's posting-yard. It was almost solemn to imagine him casually produced in the tailor's shop, and confounding the disrespectful senses of Trabb's boy. On the other hand, Trabb's boy might worm himself into his intimacy, and tell him things, or, reckless and desperate wretch as I knew he could be, might hoot him in the High Street. My patroness, too, might hear of him and not approve. On the whole, I resolved to leave the Avenger behind. It was the afternoon coach by which I had taken my place, and as winter had now come round, I should not arrive at my destination until 2 or 3 hours after dark. Our time of starting from the Cross Keys was 2 o'clock. I arrived on the ground with a quarter of an hour to spare, attended by the Avenger, if I may connect that expression with one who never attended on me if he could possibly help it. At that time it was customary to carry convicts down to the dockyards by stage-coach, as I had often heard of them in the capacity of outside passengers, and had more than once seen them on the high road dangling their iron legs over the coach roof. I had no cause to be surprised when Herbert, meeting me in the yard, came up and told me there were 2 convicts going down with me. But I had a reason that was an old reason now for constitutionally faltering whenever I heard the word convict. "You don't mind them, Handel?" said Herbert. "Oh, no. I thought you seemed as if you didn't like them." "I can't pretend that I do like them, and I suppose you don't particularly, but I don't mind them." "See, there they are," said Herbert, coming out of the tap. "What a degraded and vile sight it is." They had been treating their guard, I suppose, for they had a jailer with them, and all 3 came out wiping their mouths on their hands. The 2 convicts were handcuffed together, and had irons on their legs, irons of a pattern that I knew well. They wore the dress that I likewise knew well. Their keeper had a brace of pistols, and carried a thick knobbed bludgeon under his arm, but he was on terms of good understanding with them, and stood with them beside him, looking on at the putting to of the horses, rather with an air as if the convicts were an interesting exhibition not formally open at the moment, and he the curator. One was a taller and stouter man than the other, and appeared, as a matter of course, according to the mysterious ways of the world, both convict and free, to have had allotted to him the smaller suit of clothes. His arms and legs were like great pincushions of those shapes, and his attire disguised him absurdly. But I knew his half-closed eye at one glance. There stood the man whom I had seen on the settle at the Three Jolly Bargemen on a Saturday night, and who had brought me down with his invisible gun. It was easy to make sure that as yet he knew me no more than if he had ever seen me in his life. He looked across at me, and his eye appraised my watch-chain, and then he incidentally spat and said something to the other convict, and they laughed and slewed themselves round with a clink of their coupling manacle, and looked at something else. The great numbers on their backs, as if they were street doors, their coarse, mangy, ungainly outer service, as if they were lower animals, their ironed legs apologetically garlanded with pocket-handkerchiefs, and the way in which all present looked at them and kept from them, made them, as Herbert had said, a most disagreeable and degraded spectacle. But this was not the worst of it. It came out that the whole of the back of the coach had been taken by a family removing from London, and there were no places for the 2 prisoners but on the seat in front behind the coachman. Hereupon a choleric gentleman, who had taken the 4th place on that seat, flew into a most violent passion, and said that it was a breach of contract to mix him up with such villainous company, and that it was poisonous and pernicious and infamous and shameful, and I don't know what else. At this time the coach was ready, and the coachman impatient, and we were all preparing to get up, and the prisoners had come over with their keeper, bringing with them that curious flavour of bread poultice, baize, rope yarn, and hearthstone, which attends the convict presence. "Don't take it so much amiss, sir," pleaded the keeper to the angry passenger. "I'll sit next to you myself. Put 'em on the outside of the row. They won't interfere with you, sir. You needn't know they're there." "And don't blame me," growled the convict I had recognized. "I don't want to go. I'm quite ready to stay behind. As far as I am concerned, anyone's welcome to my place." "Or mine," said the other gruffly. "I wouldn't have incommoded none of you if I'd had my way." Then they both laughed and began cracking nuts and spitting the shells about, as I really think I should have liked to do myself if I had been in their place and so despised. At length it was voted that there was no help for the angry gentleman, and he must either go in his chance company or remain behind. So he got into his place, still making complaints, and the keeper got into the place next to him, and the convicts hauled themselves up as well as they could, and the convict I had recognized sat behind me, with his breath on the hair of my head. "Good-bye, Handel," Herbert called out as we started. I thought what a blessed fortune it was that he had found another name for me than Pip. It is impossible to express with what acuteness I felt the convict's breathing, not only on the back of my head, but all along my spine. The sensation was like being touched in the marrow with some pungent and searching acid. It set my very teeth on edge. He seemed to have more breathing business to do than another man, and to make more noise in doing it, and I was conscious of growing high-shouldered on one side in my shrinking endeavours to fend him off. The weather was miserably raw, and the two cursed the cold. It made us all lethargic before we had gone far, and when we had left the half-way house behind, we habitually dozed and shivered and were silent. I dozed off myself in considering the question whether I ought to restore a couple of pounds sterling to this creature before losing sight of him, and how it could best be done. In the act of dipping forward as if I were going to bathe among the horses, I woke in a fright and took the question up again. But I must have lost it longer than I had thought, since although I could recognise nothing in the darkness and the fitful lights and shadows of our lamps, I traced marsh country in the cold damp wind that blew at us. Cowering forward for warmth and to make me a screen against the wind, the convicts were closer to me than before. The very first words I heard them interchange as I became conscious were the words of my own thought. 2 £1 notes. "How did he get 'em?" said the convict I had never seen. "How should I know?" returned the other. "He had 'em stowed away somehows. Give him by friends, I expect." "I wish," said the other, with a bitter curse upon the cold, "that I had 'em here." 2 £1 notes, or friends? 2 £1 notes! I'd sell all the friends I ever had for one. Think it a blessed good bargain. Well, so he says. "So he says," resumed the convict I had recognised. "It was all said and done in half a minute, behind a pile of timber in the dockyard. But you're going to be discharged." Yes, I was. Would I find out that boy that had fed him and kept his secret, and give them 2 £1 notes? Yes, I would. And I did. "More fool you," growled the other. "I'd have spent 'em on a man in wittles and drink. He must have been a green one. I mean to say, he knowed nothing of you. Not a ha'porth. Different gangs and different ships. He was tried again for prison breaking, and got made a lifer." "And was that, honour, the only time you worked out in this part of the country?" "The only time." "What might have been your opinion of the place?" "Most beastly place. Mudbank, mist, swamp, and work, swamp, mist, and mudbank." They both execrated the place in very strong language, and gradually growled themselves out, and had nothing left to say. After overhearing this dialogue, I should assuredly have got down and been left in the solitude and darkness of the highway, but for feeling certain that the man had no suspicion of my identity. Indeed, I was not so changed in the course of nature, but differently dressed and so differently circumstanced, that it was not at all likely he could have known me without accidental help. Still, the coincidence of our being together on the coach was sufficiently strange to fill me with the dread that some other coincidence might at any moment connect me, in his hearing, with my name. For this reason I resolved to alight as soon as we touched the town, and put myself out of his hearing. This device I executed successfully. My little portmanteau was in the boot under my feet. I had but to turn a hinge to get it out. I threw it down before me, got down after it, and was left at the first lamp on the first stones of the town pavement. As to the convicts, they went their way with the coach, and I knew at what point they would be spirited off to the river. In my fancy I saw the boat with its convict crew waiting for them at the slime-washed stairs. Again heard the gruff "Give way, you," like an order to dogs. Again saw the wicked Noah's Ark lying out on the black water. I could not have said what I was afraid of, for my fear was altogether undefined and vague. But there was a great fear upon me as I walked on to the hotel. I felt that a dread, much exceeding the mere apprehension of a painful or disagreeable recognition, made me tremble. I am confident that it took no distinctness of shape, and that it was the revival for a few minutes of the terror of childhood. The coffee room at the Blue Boar was empty, and I had not only ordered my dinner there, but had sat down to it before the waiter knew me. As soon as he had apologized for the remissness of his memory, he asked me if he should send boots for Mr. Pumblechook. "No," said I, "certainly not." The waiter (it was he who had brought up the great remonstrance from the commercials on the day when I was bound) appeared surprised, and took the earliest opportunity of putting a dirty old copy of a local newspaper so directly in my way that I took it up and read this paragraph: "Our readers will learn, not altogether without interest, in reference to the recent romantic rise in fortune of a young artificer of iron in this neighbourhood. What a theme, by the way, for the magic pen of our as yet not universally acknowledged townsman, Tooby, the poet of our columns, that the youth's earliest patron, companion, and friend was a highly respected individual, not entirely unconnected with the corn and seed trade, and whose eminently convenient and commodious business premises are situate within 100 miles of the High Street. It is not wholly irrespective of our personal feelings that we record him as the mentor of our young Telemachus, for it is good to know that our town produced the founder of the latter's fortunes. Does the thought-contracted brow of the local sage, or the lustrous eye of the local beauty, inquire whose fortunes? We believe that Quinton Mastes was the blacksmith of Antwerp. Verb. Sap. I entertain a conviction, based upon large experience, that if in the days of my prosperity I had gone to the North Pole, I should have met somebody there, wandering Eskimo or civilized man, who would have told me that Pumblechook was my earliest patron and the founder of my fortunes. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Betimes in the morning I was up and out. It was too early yet to go to Miss Havisham, so I loitered into the country on Miss Havisham's side of town, which was not Joe's side. I could go there tomorrow, thinking about my patroness and painting brilliant pictures of her plans for me. She had adopted Estella, she had as good adopted me, and it could not fail to be her intention to bring us together. She reserved it for me to restore the desolate house, admit the sunshine into the dark rooms, set the clocks a-going and the cold hearths a-blazing, tear down the cobwebs, destroy the vermin, in short, to do all the shining deeds of the young knight of romance, and marry the princess. I had stopped to look at the house as I passed, and its seared red brick walls, blocked windows, and strong green ivy clasping even the stacks of chimneys with its twigs and tendons, as if with sinewy old arms, had made up a rich attractive mystery of which I was the hero. Estella was the inspiration of it, and the heart of it, of course, but though she had taken such strong possession of me, though my fancy and my hope were so set upon her, though her influence on my boyish life and character had been all-powerful, I did not, even that romantic morning, invest her with any attribute save those she possessed. I mention this in place of a fixed purpose, because it is the clue by which I am able to be followed into my poor labyrinth. According to my experience, the conventional notion of a lover cannot always be true. The unqualified truth is that when I loved Estella with the love of a man, I loved her simply because I found her irresistible. Once for all, I knew to my sorrow, often and often, if not always, that I loved her against reason, against promise, against peace, against hope, against happiness, against all discouragement that could be. Once for all, I loved her none the less because I knew it, and it had no more influence on restraining me than if I had devoutly believed her to be human perfection. So I shaped out my walk as to arrive at the gate at my old time. When I had rung at the bell with an unsteady hand, I turned my back upon the gate, while I tried to get my breath and keep the beating of my heart moderately quiet. I heard the side door open and steps come across the courtyard, but I pretended not to hear, even when the gate swung on its rusty hinges. Being at last touched on the shoulder, I started and turned. I started much more naturally then to find myself confronted by a man in a sober grey dress, the last man I should have expected to see in that place of porter at Miss Havisham's door. Orlick! Ah, young master, there's more changes than yours, but come in, come in. It's opposed to my orders to hold the gate open. I entered, and he swung it and locked it and took the key out. Yes, said he, facing round after doggedly preceding me a few steps towards the house. Here I am. How did you come here? I come here, he retorted, on my legs. I had my box brought alongside me in a barrow. Are you here for good? I ain't here for harm, young master, I suppose. I was not sure of that. I had a leisure to entertain the retort in my mind, while he slowly lifted his heavy glance from the pavement up my legs and arms to my face. "Then you have left the forge?" I said. "Do this look like a forge?" replied Orlick, sending his glance all around him with an air of injury. "Now, do it look like it?" I asked him how long he had left Gargery's forge. "One day is so like another here," he replied, "that I don't know without casting it up. However, I come here some time since you left. I could have told you that, Orlick." "Ah," said he, dryly, "but then you'd have got to be a scholar." By this time we had come to the house, where I found his room to be one just within the side door, with a little window in it looking on the courtyard. In its small proportions it was not unlike the kind of place usually assigned to a gate porter in Paris. Certain keys were hanging on the wall, to which he now added the gate key, and his patchwork covered bed was in a little inner division or recess. The whole had a slovenly, confined, and sleepy look, like a cage for a human dormouse, while he, looming dark and heavy in the shadow of a corner by the window, looked like the human dormouse for whom it was fitted up, as indeed he was. "I never saw this room before," I remarked, "but there used to be no porter here." "No," said he, "not till it got about that there was no protection on the premises, and it came to be considered dangerous, with convicts and tag and rag and bobtail going up and down. And then I was recommended to the place as a man who could give another man as good as he brought, and I took it. It's easier than bellowsing and hammering. That's loaded, that is." My eye had been caught by a gun with a brass-bound stock over the chimney-piece, and his eye had followed mine. "Well," said I, not desirous of more conversation, "shall I go up to Miss Havisham?" "Burn me if I know," he retorted, first stretching himself and then shaking himself. "My orders ends here, young master. I give this here bell a rap with this here hammer, and you go on along the passage till you meet somebody. I am expected, I believe." "Burn me twice over if I can say," said he. Upon that I turned down the long passage which I had first trodden in my thick boots, and he made his bell sound. At the end of the passage, while the bell was still reverberating, I found Sarah Pocket, who appeared to have now become constitutionally green and yellow by reason of me. "Oh," said she, "you, is it, Mr. Pip?" "It is, Miss Pocket. I am glad to tell you that Mr. Pocket and family are all well." "Are they any wiser?" said Sarah, with a dismal shake of the head. "They had better be wiser than well. Ah, Matthew, Matthew, you know your way, sir?" "Tolerably, for I had gone up the staircase in the dark many a time. I ascended it now in lighter boots than of yore, and tapped in my old way at the door of Miss Havisham's room. "Pip's rap," I heard her say immediately. "Come in, Pip." She was in her chair near the old table, in the old dress, with her two hands crossed on her stick, her chin resting on them, and her eyes on the fire. Sitting near her, with the white shoe that had never been worn in her hand, and her head bent as she looked at it, was an elegant lady whom I had never seen. "Come in, Pip," Miss Havisham continued to mutter, without looking round or up. "Come in, Pip. How do you do, Pip? So you kiss my hand as if I were a queen, eh? Well?" She looked up at me suddenly, only moving her eyes, and repeated in a grimly playful manner, "Well?" "I heard, Miss Havisham," said I, rather at a loss, "that you were so kind as to wish me to come and see you, and I came directly. Well?" The lady, whom I had never seen before, lifted up her eyes and looked archly at me, and then I saw that the eyes were Estella's eyes. But she was so much changed, was so much more beautiful, so much more womanly, in all things winning admiration, had made such a wonderful advance, that I seemed to have made none. I fancied, as I looked at her, that I slipped hopelessly back into the coarse and common boy again. Oh, the sense of distance and disparity that came upon me, and the inaccessibility that came about her. She gave me her hand. I stammered something about the pleasure I felt in seeing her again, and about having my look forward to it for a long, long time. "Do you find her much changed, Pip?" asked Miss Havisham, with a greedy look, and striking her stick upon a chair that stood between them, as a sign to me to sit down there. "When I came in, Miss Havisham, I thought there was nothing of Estella in the face or figure, but now it all settles down so curiously into the old—" "What?" You're not going to say into the old Estella, Miss Havisham interrupted. She was proud and insulting, and you wanted to go away from her. Don't you remember? I said confusedly that was long ago, and I knew no better then, and the like. Estella smiled with perfect composure, and said she had no doubt of my having been quite right, and of her having been very disagreeable. "Is he changed?" Miss Havisham asked her. "Very much," said Estella, looking at me. "Less coarse and common?" said Miss Havisham, playing with Estella's hair. Estella laughed, and looked at the shoe in her hand, and laughed again, and looked at me, and put the shoe down. She treated me as a boy still, but she lured me on. We sat in the dreamy room among the old strange influences which had so wrought upon me, and I learnt that she had but just come home from France, and that she was going to London. Proud and wilful as of old, she had brought those qualities into such subjection to her beauty that it was impossible, and out of nature, or I thought so, to separate them from her beauty. Truly it was impossible to disassociate her presence from all those wretched hankerings after money and gentility that had disturbed my boyhood, from all those ill-regulated aspirations that had first made me ashamed of home and Joe, from all those visions that had raised her face in the glowing fire, struck it out of the iron on the anvil, extracted it from the darkness of night to look in at the wooden window of the forge, and flit away. In a word, it was impossible for me to separate her, in the past or in the present, from the innermost life of my life. It was settled that I should stay there all the rest of the day, and return to the hotel at night, and to London to-morrow. When we had conversed for a while, Miss Havisham sent us two out to walk in the neglected garden. On our coming in by and by, she said I should wheel her about a little, as in times of yore. So Estella and I went into the garden by the gate through which I had strayed to my encounter with the pale young gentleman, now Herbert. I, trembling in spirit, and worshipping the very hem of her dress; she, quite composed, and most decidedly not worshipping the hem of mine. As we drew near to the place of the encounter, she stopped and said, "I must have been a singular little creature to hide and see that fight that day, but I did, and I enjoyed it very much." "You rewarded me very much." "Did I?" she replied, in an incidental and forgetful way. "I remember I entertained a great objection to your adversary, because I took it ill that he should be brought here to pester me with his company. He and I are great friends now." "Are you? I think I recollect, though, that you read with his father." "Yes." I made the admission with reluctance, for it seemed to have a boyish look, and she already treated me more than enough like a boy. "Since your change of fortune and prospects, you have changed your companions," said Estella. "Naturally," said I. "And necessarily," she added, in a haughty tone. "What was fit company for you once would be quite unfit company for you now." In my conscience, I doubt very much whether I had any lingering intention left of going to see Joe, but if I had, this observation put it to flight. "You had no idea of your impending good fortune in those times," said Estella, with a slight wave of her hand, signifying in the fighting times. "Not the least." The air of completeness and superiority with which she walked at my side, and the air of youthfulness and submission with which I walked at hers, made a contrast that I strongly felt. It would have rankled in me more than it did, if I had not regarded myself as eliciting it by being so set apart for her and assigned to her. The garden was too overgrown and rank for walking in with ease, and after we had made the round of it twice or thrice, we came out again into the brewery yard. I showed her to a nicety where I had seen her walking on the casks that first old day, and she said with a cold and careless look in that direction, "Did I?" I reminded her where she had come out of the house and given me my meat and drink, and she said, "I don't remember." "Not remember that you made me cry?" said I. "No," said she, and shook her head and looked about her. I verily believe that her not remembering and not minding in the least made me cry again, inwardly, and that is the sharpest crying of all. "You must know," said Estella, condescending to me as a brilliant and beautiful woman might, "that I have no heart, if that has anything to do with my memory." I got through some jargon to the effect that I took the liberty of doubting that I knew better, that there could be no such beauty without it. "Oh, I have a heart to be stabbed or shot in, I have no doubt," said Estella, "and of course if it ceased to beat I should cease to be. But you know what I mean. I have no softness there, no sympathy, sentiment, nonsense." What was it that was borne in upon my mind when she stood still and looked attentively at me? Anything that I had seen in Miss Havisham? No. In some of her looks and gestures there was that tinge of resemblance to Miss Havisham which may often be noticed to have been acquired by children from grown-up persons with whom they have been much associated and secluded, and which, when childhood is past, will produce a markable occasional likeness of expression between faces that are otherwise quite different. And yet I could not trace this to Miss Havisham. I looked again, and though she was still looking at me, the suggestion was gone. What was it? "I am serious," said Estella, not so much with a frown, for her brow was smooth, as with a darkening of her face. "If we are to be thrown much together, you had better believe it at once. No," imperiously stopping me as I opened my lips, "I have not bestowed my tenderness anywhere. I have never had any such thing." In another moment we were in the brewery, so long disused, and she pointed to the high gallery where I had seen her going out on that same first day, and she told me she remembered to have been up there, and to have seen me standing scared below. As my eyes followed her white hand, again the same dim suggestion that I could not possibly grasp crossed me. My involuntary start occasioned her to lay her hand upon my arm. Instantly the ghost passed once more, and was gone. What was it? "What is the matter?" asked Estella. "Are you scared again?" "I should be, if I believed what you said just now," I replied, to turn it off. "Then you don't. Very well. It is said, at any rate. Miss Havisham will be soon expecting you at your old post, though I think that might be laid aside now, with other old belongings. Let us make one more round of the garden, then go in. Come, you shall not shed tears for my cruelty to-day. You shall be my page, and give me your shoulder." Her handsome dress had trailed upon the ground. She held it in one hand now, and with the other lightly touched my shoulder as we walked. We walked round the ruined garden twice or thrice more, and it was all in bloom for me. If the green and yellow growth of weed in the chinks of the old wall had been the most precious flowers that ever blew, it could not have been more cherished in my remembrance. There was no discrepancy of years between us to remove her far from me. We were of nearly the same age, though of course the age told more in her case than in mine. But the air of inaccessibility which her beauty and her manner gave her tormented me in the midst of my delight, and at the height of the assurance I felt that our patroness had chosen us for one another. Wretched boy! At last we went back into the house, and there I heard with surprise that my guardian had come down to see Miss Havisham on business, and would come back to dinner. The old wintry branches of the chandeliers in the room where the mouldering table was spread had been lighted while we were out, and Miss Havisham was in her chair and waiting for me. It was like pushing the chair itself back into the past, when we began the old slow circuit round about the ashes of the bridal feast. But in the funereal room, with that figure of the grave fallen back in the chair, fixing its eyes upon her, Estella looked more bright and beautiful than before, and I was under stronger enchantment. The time so melted away that our early dinner hour drew close at hand, and Estella left us to prepare herself. We had stopped near the centre of the long table, and Miss Havisham, with one of her withered arms stretched out of the chair, rested that clenched hand upon the yellow cloth. As Estella looked back over her shoulder before going out at the door, Miss Havisham kissed that hand to her with a ravenous intensity that was of its kind quite dreadful. Then, Estella being gone, and we two left alone, she turned to me and said in a whisper, "Is she beautiful, graceful, well grown? Do you admire her?" "Everybody must who sees her, Miss Havisham." She drew an arm round my neck, and drew my head close down to hers as she sat in the chair. Love her, love her, love her. How does she use you?" Before I could answer, if I could have answered so difficult a question at all, she repeated, "Love her, love her, love her. If she favours you, love her. If she wounds you, love her. If she tears your heart to pieces, and as it gets older and stronger it will tear deeper, love her, love her, love her. Hear me, Pip. I adopted her to be loved. I bred her and educated her to be loved. I developed her into what she is, that she might be loved. Love her." Never had I seen such passionate eagerness as was joined to her utterance of these words. I could feel the muscles of the thin arm around my neck swell with the vehemence that possessed her. She said the word often enough, and there could be no doubt that she meant to say it. But if the often repeated word had been hate instead of love, despair, revenge, dire death, it could not have sounded from her lips more like a curse. "I'll tell you," said she in the same hurried, passionate whisper, "what real love is. It is blind devotion, unquestioning self-humiliation, utter submission, trust and belief against yourself and against the whole world, giving up your whole heart and soul to the smiter, as I did." When she came to that, and to a wild cry that followed that, I caught her round the waist, for she rose up in the chair in her shroud of a dress, and struck at the air as if she would soon have struck herself against the wall and fallen dead. All this passed in a few seconds. As I drew her down into her chair, I was conscious of a scent that I knew, and turning, saw my guardian in the room. He always carried, I have not mentioned it, I think, a pocket handkerchief of rich silk and of imposing proportions, which was of great value to him in his profession. I have seen him so terrify a client or a witness by ceremoniously unfolding this pocket handkerchief as if he were immediately going to blow his nose, and then pausing as if he knew he should not have time to do it before such a client or witness committed himself, that the self-committal has followed directly, quite as a matter of course. When I saw him in the room, he had this expressive pocket handkerchief in both hands, and was looking at us. On meeting my eye, he said plainly, by a momentary and silent pause in that attitude, "Indeed, singular," and then put the handkerchief into its right use with wonderful effect. Miss Havisham had seen him as soon as I, and was, like everybody else, afraid of him. She made a strong attempt to compose herself, and stammered that he was as punctual as ever. "Punctual as ever," he repeated, coming up to us. "How do you do, Pip? Shall I give you a ride, Miss Havisham, once round? And so you are here, Pip." I told him when I had arrived, and how Miss Havisham had wished me to come and see Estella, to which he replied, "Ah, very fine young lady," and then he pushed Miss Havisham in a chair before him with one of his large hands, and put the other in his trouser pocket, as if the pocket were full of secrets. "Well, Pip, how often have you seen Miss Estella before?" said he, when he came to a stop. "How often? Ah, how many times? 10,000 times?" "Oh, certainly not so many. Twice?" "Jaggers," interposed Miss Havisham, much to my relief, "leave my Pip alone, and go with him to your dinner." He complied, and we groped our way down the dark stairs together. While we were still on our way to those detached apartments across the paved yard at the back, he asked me how often I had seen Miss Havisham eat and drink, offering me a breadth of choice as usual, between 100 times and once. I considered and said, "Never." "And never will, Pip," he retorted, with a frowning smile. "She has never allowed herself to be seen doing either, since she lived in this present life of hers. She wanders about in the night, and then lays hands on such food as she takes." "Pray, sir," said I, "may I ask you a question?" "You may," said he, "and I may decline to answer it. Put your question." "Estella's name, is it Havisham, or—" I had nothing to add. "Or what?" said he. "Is it Havisham?" "It is Havisham." This brought us to the dinner table, where she and Sarah Pocket awaited us. Mr. Jaggers presided. Estella sat opposite to him. I faced my green and yellow friend. We dined very well, and were waited on by a maidservant whom I had never seen in all my comings and goings, but who, for anything I know, had been in that mysterious house the whole time. After dinner a bottle of choice old port was placed before my guardian. He was evidently well acquainted with the vintage, and the two ladies left us. Anything to equal the determined reticence of Mr. Jaggers under that roof I never saw elsewhere, even in him. He kept his very looks to himself, and scarcely directed his eyes to Estella's face once during dinner. When she spoke to him he listened, and in due course answered, but never looked at her that I could see. On the other hand, she often looked at him with interest and curiosity, if not distrust, but his face never showed the least consciousness. Throughout dinner he took a dry delight in making Sarah Pocket greener and yellower, by often referring in conversation with me to my expectations. But here again he showed no consciousness, and even made it appear that he extorted, and even did extort, though I don't know how, those references out of my innocent self. And when he and I were left alone together, he sat with an air upon him of general lying in consequence of information he possessed, that really was too much for me. He cross-examined his very wine when he had nothing else in hand. He held it between himself and the candle, tasted the port, rolled it in his mouth, swallowed it, looked at his glass again, smelt the port, tried it, drank it, filled it again, and cross-examined the glass again, until I was as nervous as if I had known the wine to be telling him something to my disadvantage. 3 or 4 times I feebly thought I would start conversation, but whenever he saw me going to ask him anything, he looked at me with his glass in his hand and rolling his wine about in his mouth, as if requesting me to take notice that it was of no use, for he couldn't answer. I think Miss Pocket was conscious that the sight of me involved her in the danger of being goaded to madness, and perhaps tearing off her cap, which was a very hideous one, in the nature of a muslin mop, and strewing the ground with her hair, which assuredly had never grown on her head. She did not appear when we afterwards went up to Miss Havisham's room, and we 4 played at whist. In the interval Miss Havisham, in a fantastic way, had put some of the most beautiful jewels from her dressing-table into Estella's hair and about her bosom and arms, and I saw even my guardian look at her from under his thick eyebrows, and raise them a little when her loveliness was before him with those rich flushes of glitter and colour in it. On the manner and extent to which he took our trumps into custody, and came out with mean little cards at the ends of hands, before which the glory of our kings and queens was utterly abased, I say nothing, nor of the feeling that I had respecting his looking upon us personally in the light of 3 very obvious and poor riddles that he had found out long ago. What I suffered from was the incompatibility between his cold presence and my feelings towards Estella. It was not that I knew I could never bear to speak to him about her, that I knew I could never bear to hear him creak his boots at her, that I knew I could never bear to see him wash his hands of her. It was that my admiration should be within a foot or 2 of him. It was that my feelings should be in the same place with him. That was the agonizing circumstance. We played until 9 o'clock, and then it was arranged that when Estella came to London I should be forewarned of her coming, and should meet her at the coach, and then I took leave of her, and touched her, and left her. My guardian lay at the Boar in the next room to mine. Far into the night Miss Havisham's words, "Love her, love her, love her," sounded in my ears. I had adapted them for my own repetition, and said to my pillow, "I love her, I love her, I love her," hundreds of times. Then a burst of gratitude came upon me that she should be destined for me, once the blacksmith's boy. Then I thought, if she were, as I feared, by no means rapturously grateful for that destiny yet, when would she begin to be interested in me? When should I awaken the heart within her that was mute and sleeping now? Ah me, I thought those were high and great emotions, but I never thought there was anything low and small in my keeping away from Joe, because I knew she would be contemptuous of him. It was but a day gone and Joe had brought tears into my eyes. They had soon dried. God forgive me, soon dried. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After well considering the matter while I was dressing at the Blue Boar in the morning, I resolved to tell my guardian that I doubted Orlick's being the right sort of man to fill a post of trust at Miss Havisham's. "Why, of course he's not the right sort of man, Pitt," said my guardian, comfortably satisfied beforehand on the general head, "because the man who fills the post of trust never is the right sort of man." It seemed quite to put him into spirits to find that this particular post was not exceptionally held by the right sort of man, and he listened in a satisfied manner while I told him what knowledge I had of Orlick. "Very good, Pip," he observed, when I had concluded. "I'll go round presently and pay our friend off." Rather alarmed by this summary action, I was for a little delay, and even hinted that our friend himself might be difficult to deal with. "Oh no, he won't," said my guardian, making his pocket-handkerchief point with perfect confidence. "I should like to see him argue the question with me." As we were going back together to London by the midday coach, and as I breakfasted under such terrors of Pumblechook that I could scarcely hold my cup, this gave me an opportunity of saying that I wanted a walk, and that I would go along the London road while Mr. Jaggers was occupied, if he would let the coachman know that I would get into my place when overtaken. I was thus enabled to fly from the Blue Boar immediately after breakfast, by then making a loop of about a couple of miles into the open country at the back of Pumblechook's premises. I got round into the High Street again, a little beyond that pitfall, and felt myself in comparative security. It was interesting to be in the quiet old town once more, and it was not disagreeable to be here and there suddenly recognised and stared after. One or two of the tradespeople even darted out of their shops and went a little way down the street before me, that they might turn as if they had forgotten something and pass me face to face, on which occasions I don't know whether they or I made the worse pretence, they of not doing it, or I of not seeing it. Still, my position was a distinguished one, and I was not at all dissatisfied with it, until fate threw me in the way of that unlimited miscreant, Trabb's boy. Casting my eyes along the street at a certain point of my progress, I beheld Trabb's boy approaching, lashing himself with an empty blue bag. Deeming that a serene and unconscious contemplation of him would beseem me, and would be most likely to quell his evil mind, I advanced with that expression of countenance, and was rather congratulating myself on my success, when suddenly the knees of Trabb's boy smote together. His hair uprose, his cap fell off, he trembled violently in every limb, and staggered out into the road, and crying to the populace, "Hold me, I'm so frightened," feigned to be in a paroxysm of terror, occasioned by the dignity of my appearance. As I passed him, his teeth loudly chattered in his head, and with every mark of extreme humiliation he prostrated himself in the dust. This was a hard thing to bear, but this was nothing. I had not advanced another 200 yards, when, to my inexpressible terror, amazement, and indignation, I again beheld Trabb's boy approaching. He was coming round a narrow corner, his blue bag was slung over his shoulder, honest industry beamed in his eyes, a determination to proceed to Trabb's with cheerful briskness was indicated in his gait. With a shock he became aware of me, and was severely visited as before, but this time his motion was rotary, and he staggered round and round me with knees more afflicted, and with uplifted hands as if beseeching for mercy. His sufferings were hailed with the greatest of joy by a knot of spectators, and I felt utterly confounded. I had not got much as further down the street as the post office, when again I beheld Trabb's boy shooting round by a back way. This time he was entirely changed. He wore the blue bag in the manner of my greatcoat, and was strutting along the pavement towards me on the opposite side of the street, attended by a company of delighted young friends, to whom he from time to time exclaimed, with a wave of his hand, "Don't know yer." Words cannot state the amount of aggravation and injury wreaked upon me by Trabb's boy. When passing abreast of me, he pulled up his shirt collar, twined his side hair, stuck an arm akimbo, and smirked extravagantly by wriggling his elbows and body, and drawling to his attendants, "Don't know yer, don't know yer, 'pon my soul, don't know yer." The disgrace attendant on his immediately afterwards taking to crowing and pursuing me across the bridge with crows, as from an exceedingly dejected fowl who had known me when I was a blacksmith, culminated the disgrace with which I left the town, and was, so to speak, ejected by it into the open country. But unless I had taken the life of Trabb's boy on that occasion, I really do not know, even now, see what I could have done save endure. To have struggled with him in the street, or to have exacted any lower recompense from him than his heart's best blood, would have been futile and degrading. Moreover, he was a boy whom no man could hurt, an invulnerable and dodging serpent, who, when chased into a corner, flew out again between his captor's legs, scornfully yelping. I wrote, however, to Mr. Trabb by next day's post, to say that Mr. Pip must decline to deal further with one who could so far forget what he owed to the best interests of society as to employ a boy who excited loathing in every respectable mind. The coach, with Mr. Jaggers inside, came up in due time, and I took my box seat again, and arrived in London safe, but not sound, for my heart was gone. As soon as I arrived, I sent a penitential codfish and a barrel of oysters to Joe, as reparation for not having gone myself, and then went on to Barnard's Inn. I found Herbert dining on cold meat, and delighted to welcome me back. Having dispatched the Avenger to the coffee house for an addition to the dinner, I felt that I must open my breast that very evening to my friend and chum. As confidence was out of the question with the Avenger in the hall, which could merely be regarded in the light of an antechamber to the keyhole, I sent him to the play. A better proof of the severity of my bondage to that taskmaster could scarcely be afforded than the degrading shifts to which I was constantly driven to find him employment. So mean is extremity that I sometimes sent him to Hyde Park Corner to see what o'clock it was. Dinner done, and we sitting with our feet upon the fender, I said to Herbert, "My dear Herbert, I have something very particular to tell you." "My dear Handel," he returned, "I shall esteem and respect your confidence." "It concerns myself, Herbert," said I, "and one other person." Herbert crossed his feet, looked at the fire with his head on one side, and having looked at it in vain for some time, looked at me because I didn't go on. "Herbert," said I, laying my hand upon his knee, "I love, I adore Estella." Instead of being transfixed, Herbert replied in an easy, matter-of-course way, "Exactly. Well?" "Well, Herbert, is that all you say? Well, what next, I mean?" said Herbert. "Of course I know that." "How do you know it?" said I. "How do I know it, Handel? Why, from you. I never told you." "Told me? You have never told me when you got your hair cut, but I have had senses to perceive it. You have always adored her, ever since I have known you. You brought your adoration and your portmanteau here together. Told me? Why, you have always told me all day long. When you told me your own story, you told me plainly that you began adoring her the first time you saw her, when you were very young indeed." "Very well, then," said I, to whom this was a new and not unwelcome light, "I have never left off adoring her, and she has come back a most beautiful and most elegant creature, and I saw her yesterday, and if I adored her before, I now doubly adore her." "Lucky for you, then, Handel," said Herbert, "that you are picked out for her and allotted to her. Without encroaching on forbidden ground, we may venture to say there can be no doubt between ourselves of that fact. Have you any idea yet of Estella's views on the adoration question?" I shook my head gloomily. "Oh, she is thousands of miles away from me," said I. "Patience, my dear Handel. Time enough, time enough. But you have something more to say?" "I am ashamed to say it," I returned, "and yet it's no worse to say it than to think it. You call me a lucky fellow. Of course I am. I was a blacksmith's boy but yesterday. I am, what shall I say I am, to-day? "Say a good fellow if you want a phrase," returned Herbert, smiling and clapping his hand on the back of mine. "A good fellow, with impetuosity and hesitation, boldness and diffidence, action and dreaming curiously mixed in him." I stopped for a moment to consider whether there really was this mixture in my character. On the whole, I by no means recognized the analysis, but I thought it not worth disputing. "When I ask what I am to call myself to-day, Herbert," I went on, "I suggest what I have in my thoughts. You say I am lucky. I know I have done nothing to raise myself in life, and that fortune alone has raised me, that is, being very lucky. And yet when I think of Estella, and when you don't, you know," Herbert threw in, with his eyes on the fire, which I thought kind and sympathetic of him, "then, my dear Herbert, I cannot tell you how dependent and uncertain I feel, and how exposed to hundreds of chances. Avoiding forbidden ground, as you did just now, I may still say that on the constancy of one person, naming no person, all my expectations depend. And at the best, how indefinite and unsatisfactory only to know so vaguely what they are." In saying this, I relieved my mind of what had always been there, more or less, though no doubt most since yesterday. "Now, Handel," Herbert replied in his gay, hopeful way, "it seems to me that in the despondency of the tender passion we are looking into our gift horse's mouth with a magnifying glass. Likewise, it seems to me that, concentrating our attention on the examination, we altogether overlook one of the best points of the animal. Didn't you tell me that your guardian, Mr. Jaggers, told you in the beginning that you were not endowed with expectations only? And even if he had not told you so, though that is a very large if, I grant, could you believe that of all men in London Mr. Jaggers is the man to hold his present relations towards you, unless he were sure of his ground?" I said I could not deny that this was a strong point. I said it, people often do so in such cases, like a rather reluctant concession to truth and justice, as if I wanted to deny it. "I should think it was a strong point," said Herbert, "and I should think you would be puzzled to imagine a stronger. As to the rest, you must bide your guardian's time, and he must bide his client's time. You'll be 21 before you know where you are, and then perhaps you'll get some further enlightenment. At all events, you'll be nearer getting it, for it must come at last." "What a hopeful disposition you have," said I, gratefully admiring his cheery ways. "I ought to have," said Herbert, "for I have not much else. I must acknowledge, by the by, that the good sense of what I have just said is not my own, but my father's. The only remark I ever heard him make on your story was the final one. The thing is settled and done, or Mr. Jaggers would not be in it. And now, before I say anything more about my father, or my father's son, and repay confidence with confidence, I want to make myself seriously disagreeable to you for a moment, positively repulsive." "You won't succeed," said I. "Oh yes, I shall," said he. 1, 2, 3, and now I'm in for it. Handel, my good fellow," though he spoke in this light tone, he was very much in earnest, "I have been thinking, since we have been talking with our feet on this fender, that Estella surely cannot be a condition of your inheritance if she was never referred to by your guardian. Am I right in so understanding what you have told me, as that he never referred to her, directly or indirectly, in any way? Never even hinted, for instance, that your patron might have views as to your marriage ultimately?" "Never. Now, Handel, I am quite free from the flavour of sour grapes, upon my soul and honour. Not being bound to her, can you not detach yourself from her?" I told you I should be disagreeable. I turned my head aside, for with a rush and a sweep, like the old marsh winds coming up from the sea, a feeling like that which had subdued me on the morning when I left the forge, when the mists were solemnly rising, and when I had laid my hand upon the village finger-post, smote upon my heart again. There was a silence between us for a little while. "Yes, but my dear Handel," Herbert went on, as if we had been talking instead of silent, "its having been so strongly rooted in the breast of a boy whom nature and circumstances made so romantic, renders it very serious. Think of her bringing up, and think of Miss Havisham. Think of what she is herself. Now I am repulsive to you, and you abominate me. This may lead to miserable things." "I know it, Herbert," said I, with my head still turned away, "but I can't help it." "You can't detach yourself?" "No, impossible." "You can't try, Handel?" "No, impossible." "Well," said Herbert, getting up with a lively shake as if he had been asleep, and stirring the fire, "now I'll endeavour to make myself agreeable again." So he went round the room and shook the curtains out, put the chairs in their places, tidied the books and so forth that were lying about, looked into the hall, peeped into the letter box, shut the door, and came back to his chair by the fire, where he sat down, nursing his left leg in both arms. "I was going to say a word or two, Handel, concerning my father and my father's son. I am afraid it is scarcely necessary for my father's son to remark that my father's establishment is not particularly brilliant in its housekeeping." "There is always plenty, Herbert," said I, to say something encouraging. "Oh yes, and so the dustman says, I believe with the strongest approval, and so does the marine store shop in the back street. Gravely, Handel, for the subject is grave enough. You know how it is as well as I do. I suppose there was a time once when my father had not given matters up, but if ever there was a time, the time is gone. May I ask you if you have ever had an opportunity of remarking, down in your part of the country, that the children of not exactly suitable marriages are always most particularly anxious to be married?" This was such a singular question that I asked him in return, "Is it so?" "I don't know," said Herbert. "That's what I want to know, because it is decidedly the case with us. My poor sister Charlotte, who was next me, and died before she was 14, was a striking example. Little Jane is the same, in a desire to be matrimonially established. You might suppose her to have passed her short existence in the perpetual contemplation of domestic bliss. Little Alec in a frock has already made arrangements for his union with a suitable young person at Kew, and indeed I think we are all engaged except the baby." "Then you are?" said I. "I am," said Herbert, "but it's a secret." I assured him of my keeping the secret, and begged to be favoured with further particulars. He had spoken so sensibly and feelingly of my weakness that I wanted to know something about his strength. "May I ask the name?" I said. "Name of Clara," said Herbert. "Live in London?" "Yes. Perhaps I ought to mention," said Herbert, who had become curiously crestfallen and meek since we entered on the interesting theme, "that she is rather below my mother's nonsensical family notions. Her father had to do with the victualling of passenger ships. I think he was a species of purser." "What is he now?" said I. "He's an invalid now," replied Herbert, "living on—" "On the first floor," said Herbert, which was not at all what I meant, for I had intended my question to apply to his means. "I have never seen him, for he has always kept his room overhead since I have known Clara, but I have heard him occasionally. He makes tremendous rows, roars, and pegs at the floor with some frightful instrument. In looking at me and then laughing heartily, Herbert for the time recovered his usual lively manner. "Don't you expect to see him?" said I. "Oh yes, I constantly expect to see him," returned Herbert, "because I never hear him without expecting him to come tumbling through the ceiling. But I don't know how long the rafters may hold." When he had once more laughed heartily, he became meek again, and told me that the moment he began to realize capital, it was his intention to marry this young lady. He added, as a self-evident proposition engendering low spirits, "But you can't marry, you know, while you're looking about you." As we contemplated the fire, and as I thought what a difficult vision to realize this same capital sometimes was, I put my hands in my pockets, a folded piece of paper in one of them attracting my attention. I opened it, and found it to be the playbill I had received from Joe, relative to the celebrated provincial amateur of Roscian renown, and bless my heart, I involuntarily added aloud, "It's to-night." This changed the subject in an instant, and made us hurriedly resolve to go to the play. So when I had pledged myself to comfort and abet Herbert in the affair of his heart by all practicable and impracticable means, and when Herbert had told me that his affianced already knew me by reputation, and that I should be presented to her, and when we had warmly shaken hands upon our mutual confidence, we blew out our candles, made up our fire, locked our door, and issued forth in quest of Mr. Wopsle and Denmark. Chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On our arrival in Denmark, we found the king and queen of that country elevated in two arm chairs on a kitchen table, holding a court. The whole of the Danish nobility were in attendance, consisting of a noble boy in the wash-leather boots of our gigantic ancestor, a venerable peer with a dirty face, who seemed to have risen from the people late in life, and the Danish chivalry with a comb in its hair and a pair of white silk legs, and presenting on the whole a feminine appearance. My gifted townsman stood gloomily apart, with folded arms, and I could have wished that his curls and forehead had been more probable. Several curious little circumstances transpired as the action proceeded. The late king of the country not only appeared to have been troubled with a cough at the time of his decease, but to have taken it with him to the tomb, and to have brought it back. The royal phantom also carried a ghostly manuscript round its truncheon, to which it had the appearance of occasionally referring, and that too with an air of anxiety, and a tendency to lose the place of reference, which were suggestive of a state of mortality. It was this, I conceive, which led to the shades being advised by the gallery to turn over, a recommendation which it took extremely ill. It was likewise to be noted of this majestic spirit, that whereas it always appeared with an air of having been out a long time and walked an immense distance, it perceptibly came from a closely contiguous wall. This occasioned its terrors to be received derisively. The Queen of Denmark, a very buxom lady, though no doubt historically brazen, was considered by the public to have too much brass about her, her chin being attached to her diadem by a broad band of that metal, as if she had a gorgeous toothache, her waist being encircled by another, and each of her arms by another, so that she was openly mentioned as the kettle drum. The noble boy in the ancestral boots was inconsistent, representing himself, as it were in one breath, as an able seaman, a strolling actor, a grave digger, a clergyman, and a person of the utmost importance at a court fencing match, on the authority of whose practised eye and nice discrimination the finest strokes were judged. This gradually led to a want of toleration for him, and even on his being detected in holy orders and declining to perform the funeral service, to the general indignation taking the form of nuts. Lastly, Ophelia was a prey to such slow musical madness, that when, in course of time, she had taken off her white muslin scarf, folded it up, and buried it, a sulky man, who had been long cooling his impatient nose against an iron bar in the front row of the gallery, growled, "Now the baby's put to bed, let's have supper," which, to say the least of it, was out of keeping. Upon my unfortunate townsman all these incidents accumulated with playful effect. Whenever that undecided prince had to ask a question or state a doubt, the public helped him out with it, as, for example, on the question whether "'twas nobler in the mind to suffer," some roared yes, and some no, and some, inclining to both opinions, said "toss up for it," and quite a debating society arose. When he asked what should such fellows do as he, crawling between earth and heaven, he was encouraged with loud cries of "Hear, hear." When he appeared with his stocking disordered, its disorder expressed according to usage by one very neat fold in the top, which I suppose to be always got up with a flat iron, a conversation took place in the gallery respecting the paleness of his leg, and whether it was occasioned by the turn the ghost had given him. On his taking the recorders, very like a little black flute that had just been played in the orchestra and handed out at the door, he was called upon unanimously for Rule Britannia. When he recommended the player not to saw the air thus, the sulky man said, "And don't you do it neither, you're a deal worse than him." And I grieve to add that peals of laughter greeted Mr. Wopsle on every one of these occasions. But his greatest trials were in the churchyard, which had the appearance of a primeval forest, with a kind of small ecclesiastical wash-house on one side, and a turnpike gate on the other. Mr. Wopsle, in a comprehensive black cloak, being descried entering at the turnpike, the grave digger was admonished in a friendly way, "Look out, here's the undertaker coming to see how you're getting on with your work." I believe it is well known in a constitutional country that Mr. Wopsle could not possibly have returned the skull, after moralizing over it, without dusting his fingers on a white napkin taken from his breast. But even that innocent and indispensable action did not pass without comment. "Waiter!" The arrival of the body for interment, in an empty black box with the lid tumbling open, was a signal for a general joy, which was much enhanced by the discovery among the bearers of an individual obnoxious to identification. The joy attended Mr. Wopsle through his struggle with Laertes on the brink of the orchestra and the grave, and slackened no more until he had tumbled the king off the kitchen table, and had died by inches from the ankles upwards. We had made some pale efforts in the beginning to applaud Mr. Wopsle, but they were too hopeless to be persisted in. Therefore we had sat feeling keenly for him, but laughing nevertheless, from ear to ear. I laughed in spite of myself all the time. The whole thing was so droll, and yet I had a latent impression that there was something decidedly fine in Mr. Wopsle's elocution. Not for old association's sake, I am afraid, but because it was very slow, very dreary, very uphill and downhill, and very unlike any way in which any man in any natural circumstance of life or death ever expressed himself about anything. When the tragedy was over, and he had been called for and hooted, I said to Herbert, "Let us go at once, or perhaps we shall meet him." We made all the haste we could downstairs, but we were not quick enough either. Standing at the door was a Jewish man with an unnatural heavy smear of eyebrow, who caught my eyes as we advanced, and said when we came up with him, "Mr. Pip and friend?" Identity of Mr. Pip and friend confessed. "Mr. Waldengarver," said the man, "would be glad to have the honour." "Waldengarver?" I repeated, when Herbert murmured in my ear, "Probably Wopsle." "Oh," said I, "yes, shall we follow you?" "A few steps, please." When we were in a side alley, he turned and asked, "How did you think he looked? I dressed him." I don't know what he had looked like, except a funeral, with the addition of a large Danish sun or star hanging round his neck by a blue ribbon, that had given him the appearance of being insured in some extraordinary fire office. But I said he had looked very nice. "When he come to the grave," said our conductor, "he showed his cloak beautiful, but judging from the wing, it looked to me that when he see the ghost in the Queen's apartment, he might have made more of his stockings." I modestly assented, and we all fell through a little dirty swing door into a sort of hot packing case immediately behind it. Here Mr. Wopsle was divesting himself of his Danish garments, and here there was just room for us to look at him over one another's shoulders, by keeping the packing case door or lid wide open. "Gentlemen," said Mr. Wopsle, "I am proud to see you. I hope, Mr. Pip, you will excuse my sending round. I had the happiness to know you in former times, and the drama has ever had a claim which has ever been acknowledged on the noble and the affluent." Meanwhile Mr. Waldengarver, in a frightful perspiration, was trying to get himself out of his princely sables. "Skin the stockings off, Mr. Waldengarver," said the owner of that property, "or you'll bust 'em, and you'll bust 35 shillings. Shakespeare was never complimented with a finer pair. Keep quiet in your chair now, and leave 'em to me." With that he went upon his knees and began to flay his victim, who on the first stocking coming off would certainly have fallen over backward with his chair, but for there being no room to fall anyhow. I had been afraid until then to say a word about the play, but then Mr. Waldengarver looked up at us complacently and said, "Gentlemen, how did it seem to you to go in front?" Herbert said from behind, at the same time poking me, "Capitally." So I said, "Capitally." "How did you like my reading of the character, gentlemen?" said Mr. Waldengarver, almost, if not quite, with patronage. Herbert said from behind, again poking me, "Massive and concrete." So I said boldly, as if I had originated it and must beg to insist upon it, "Massive and concrete." "I'm glad to have your approbation, gentlemen," said Mr. Waldengarver with an air of dignity, in spite of his being ground against the wall at the time and holding on by the seat of the chair. "But I'll tell you one thing, Mr. Waldengarver," said the man who was on his knees, "in which you're out in your reading. Now don't care who says contrary, I tell you so. You're out of your reading in Hamlet when you get your legs in profile. The last Hamlet as I dressed made the same mistakes in his reading at rehearsal, till I got him to put a large red wafer on each of his shins, and then at that rehearsal, which was the last, I went in front, sir, to the back of the pit, and whenever his reading brought him into profile, I called out, 'I don't see no wafers,' and at night his reading was lovely." Mr. Waldengarver smiled at me, as much as to say, "A faithful dependent, I overlook his folly," and then said aloud, "My view is a little classic and thoughtful for them here, but they will improve, they will improve." Herbert and I said together, "Oh, no doubt they would improve." "Did you observe, gentlemen," said Mr. Waldengarver, "that there was a man in the gallery who endeavoured to cast derision on the service, I mean the representation?" We basely replied that we rather thought we had noticed such a man. I added, "He was drunk, no doubt." "Oh dear no, sir," said Mr. Wopsle, "not drunk. His employer would see to that, sir. His employer would not allow him to be drunk." "You know his employer?" said I. Mr. Wopsle shut his eyes and opened them again, performing both ceremonies very slowly. "You must have observed, gentlemen," said he, "an ignorant and blatant ass, with a rasping throat and a countenance expressive of low malignity, who went through, I will not say sustained, the rôle, if I may use a French expression, of Claudius, King of Denmark. That is his employer, gentlemen. Such is the profession." Without distinctly knowing whether I should have been more sorry for Mr. Wopsle if he had been in despair, I was so sorry for him as it was that I took the opportunity of his turning round to have his braces put on, which jostled us out at the doorway, to ask Herbert what he thought of having him home to supper. Herbert said he thought it would be kind to do so. Therefore I invited him, and he went to Barnard's with us, wrapped up to the eyes, and we did our best for him, and he sat until 2 o'clock in the morning, reviewing his success and developing his plans. I forget in detail what they were, but I have a general recollection that he was to begin with reviving the drama, and to end with crushing it, inasmuch as his decease would leave it utterly bereft and without a chance or hope. Miserably I went to bed after all, and miserably thought of Estella, and miserably dreamed that my expectations were all cancelled, and that I had to give my hand in marriage to Herbert's Clara, or play Hamlet to Miss Havisham's ghost before 20,000 people, without knowing 20 words of it. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. One day, when I was busy with my books and Mr. Pocket, I received a note by the post, the mere outside of which threw me into a great flutter. For, though I had never seen the handwriting in which it was addressed, I divined whose hand it was. It had no set beginning, as "Dear Mr. Pip," or "Dear Pip," or "Dear Sir," or "Dear anything," but it ran thus: "I am to come to London the day after tomorrow by the midday coach. I believe it was settled you should meet me. At all events, Miss Havisham has that impression, and I write in obedience to it. She sends you her regard. Yours, Estella." If there had been time, I should probably have ordered several suits of clothes for this occasion, but there was not. I was fain to be content with those I had. My appetite vanished instantly, and I knew no peace or rest until the day arrived. Not that its arrival brought me either, for then I was worse than ever, and began haunting the coach office in Wood Street, Cheapside, before the coach had left the Blue Boar in our town. For all that I knew this perfectly well, I still felt as if it were not safe to let the coach office be out of my sight longer than 5 minutes at a time, and in this condition of unreason I had performed the first half hour of a watch of 4 or 5 hours, when Wemmick ran against me. "Halloa, Mr. Pip," said he, "how do you do? I should hardly have thought this was your beat." I explained that I was waiting to meet somebody who was coming up by coach, and I inquired after the castle and the aged. "Both flourishing, thank'ee," said Wemmick, "and particularly the aged. He's in wonderful feather. He'll be 82 next birthday. I have a notion of firing 82 times if the neighbourhood shouldn't complain, and that the cannon of mine should prove equal to the pressure. However, this is not London talk. Where do you think I am going to?" "To the office," said I. for he was tending in that direction. "Next thing to it," returned Wemmick. "I'm going to Newgate. We are in a banker's parcel case just at present, and I have been down the road taking a squint at the scene of action, and thereupon must have a word or two with our client." "Did your client commit the robbery?" I asked. "Bless your soul and body, no," answered Wemmick very dryly. "But he is accused of it. So might you or I be. Either of us might be accused of it, you know." "Only neither of us is," I remarked. "Yah," said Wemmick, touching me on the breast with his forefinger. "You're a deep one, Mr. Pip. Would you like to have a look at Newgate? Have you time to spare?" I had so much time to spare that the proposal came as a relief, notwithstanding its irreconcilability with my latent desire to keep my eye on the coach office. Muttering that I would make the inquiry whither I had time to walk with him, I went into the office and ascertained from the clerk, with the nicest precision, and much to the trying of his temper, the earliest moment at which the coach could be expected, which I knew beforehand quite as well as he. I then rejoined Mr. Wemmick, and affecting to consult my watch, and to be surprised by the information I had received, accepted his offer. We were at Newgate in a few minutes, and we passed through the lodge, where some fetters were hanging up on the bare walls among the prison rules, into the interior of the jail. At that time jails were much neglected, and the period of exaggerated reaction consequent on all public wrongdoing, and which is always its heaviest and longest punishment, was still far off. So felons were not lodged and fed better than soldiers, to say nothing of paupers, and seldom set fire to their prisons with the excusable object of improving the flavour of their soup. It was visiting time when Wemmick took me in, and a potman was going his rounds with beer, and the prisoners behind bars in yards were buying beer and talking to friends, and a frowsy, ugly, disorderly, depressing scene it was. It struck me that Wemmick walked among the prisoners much as a gardener might walk among his plants. This was first put into my head by his seeing a shoot that had come up in the night, and saying, "What, Captain Tom, are you there? Ah, indeed! And also, is that Black Bill behind the cistern? Why, I didn't look for you these 2 months. How do you find yourself?" Equally in his stopping at the bars and attending to anxious whisperers, always singly, Wemmick, with his post office in an immovable state, looked at them while in conference, as if he were taking particular notice of the advance they had made since he last observed, towards coming out in full blow at their trial. He was highly popular, and I found that he took the familiar department of Mr. Jaggers's business, though something of the state of Mr. Jaggers's hung about him too, forbidding approach beyond certain limits. His personal recognition of each successive client was compromised in a nod, and his settling his hat a little easier on his head with both hands, and then tightening the post office and putting his hands in his pockets. In 1 or 2 instances there was a difficulty respecting the raising of fees, and then Mr. Wemmick, backing as far as possible from the insufficient money produced, said, "It's no use, my boy, I'm only a subordinate, I can't take it. Don't go on in that way with a subordinate. If you're unable to make up your quantum, my boy, you had better address yourself to a principal. There are plenty of principals in the profession, you know, and what is not worth the while of one may be worth the while of another. That's my recommendation to you, speaking as a subordinate. Don't try on useless measures. Why should you? Now, who's next?" Thus we walked through Wemmick's greenhouse. Notice the man I shall shake hands with. I should have done so without the preparation, as he had shaken hands with no one yet. Almost as soon as he had spoken, a portly, upright man, whom I can see now as I write, in a well-worn olive-coloured frock-coat, with a peculiar pallor overspreading the red in his complexion, and eyes that went wandering about when he tried to fix them, came up to a corner of the bars and put his hand to his hat, which had a greasy and fatty surface like cold broth, with a half serious and half jocose military salute. "Colonel to you," said Wemmick. "How are you, Colonel?" "All right, Mr. Wemmick." "Everything was done that could be done, but the evidence was too strong for us, Colonel." "Yes, it was too strong, sir, but I don't care." "No, no," said Wemmick coolly, "you don't care." Then turning to me, "Served His Majesty, this man?" was a soldier in the line and bought his discharge. I said, indeed, and the man's eyes looked at me, and then looked over my head, and then looked all around me, and then he drew his hand across his lips and laughed. "I think I shall be out of this on Monday, sir," he said to Wemmick. "Perhaps," returned my friend, "but there's no knowing." "I'm glad to have the chance of bidding you good-bye, Mr. Wemmick," said the man, stretching out his hand between two bars. "Thank'ee," said Wemmick, shaking hands with him. "Same to you, Colonel." "If what I had upon me when I was taken had been real, Mr. Wemmick," said the man, unwilling to let his hand go, "I should have asked the favour of your wearing another ring, in acknowledgment of your attentions." "I'll accept the will for the deed," said Wemmick. "By the by, you were quite a pigeon fancier." The man looked up at the sky. "I am told you had a remarkable breed of tumblers. Could you commission any friend of yours to bring me a pair, or you've no further use for 'em?" "It shall be done, sir." "All right," said Wemmick, "they shall be taken care of. Good afternoon, Colonel. Good bye." They shook hands again, and as we walked away Wemmick said to me, "A coiner, a very good workman. The recorder's report is made to day, and he's sure to be executed on Monday. Still, you see, as far as it goes, a pair of pigeons are portable property all the same." With that he looked back and nodded at this dead plant, and then cast his eyes about him in walking out of the yard, as if he were considering what other pot would go best in its place. As we came out of the prison through the lodge, I found that the great importance of my guardian was appreciated by the turnkeys, no less than by those whom they held in charge. "Well, Mr. Wemmick," said the turnkey, who kept us between the two studded and spiked lodge gates, and who carefully locked one before he unlocked the other, "what's Mr. Jaggers going to do with that waterside murder? Is he going to make it a manslaughter, or what's he going to make of it?" "Why don't you ask him?" returned Wemmick. "Oh yes, I dare say," said the turnkey. "Now that's the way with them here, Mr. Pip," remarked Wemmick, turning to me with his post office elongated. "They don't mind what they ask of me, the subordinate, but you'll never catch 'em asking any questions of my principal." "Is this young gentleman one of the 'prentices or articled ones of your office?" asked the turnkey, with a grin at Mr. Wemmick's humour. "There he goes again, you see," cried Wemmick. "I told you so. Asks another question of the subordinate before his first is dry. Well, supposing Mr. Pip is one of them?" "Why then," said the turnkey, grinning again, "he knows what Mr. Jaggers is." "Yah!" cried Wemmick, suddenly hitting out at the turnkey in a facetious way. "You're dumb as one of your own keys when you have to do with my principal. You know you are. Let us out, you old fox, or I'll get him to bring an action against you for false imprisonment." The turnkey laughed and gave us good day, and stood laughing at us over the spikes of the wicket when we descended the steps into the street. "Mind you, Mr. Pip," said Wemmick gravely in my ear, as he took my arm to be more confidential, "I don't know that Mr. Jaggers does a better thing than the way in which he keeps himself so high. He's always so high. His constant height is of a piece with his immense abilities. That colonel durst no more take leave of him than that turnkey durst ask him his intentions respecting a case. Then between his height and them, he slips in his subordinate, don't you see, and so he has 'em, soul and body." I was very much impressed, and not for the first time, by my guardian's subtlety. To confess the truth, I very heartily wished, and not for the first time, that I had some other guardian of minor abilities. Mr. Wemmick and I parted at the office in Little Britain, where suppliants for Mr. Jaggers' notice were lingering about as usual, and I returned to my watch in the street of the coach office, with some 3 hours on hand. I consumed the whole time in thinking how strange it was that I should be encompassed by all this taint of prison and crime; that, in my childhood, out on our lonely marshes, on a winter evening, I should have first encountered it; that it should have reappeared on 2 occasions, starting out like a stain that was faded but not gone; that it should in this new way pervade my fortune and advancement. While my mind was thus engaged, I thought of beautiful young Estella, proud and refined, coming towards me, and I thought with absolute abhorrence of the contrast between the jail and her. I wished that Wemmick had not met me, or that I had not yielded to him and gone with him, so that, of all days in the year on this day, I might not have had Newgate in my breath and on my clothes. I beat the prison dust off my feet as I sauntered to and fro, and I shook it out of my dress, and I exhaled its hair from my lungs. So contaminated did I feel, remembering who was coming, that the coach came quickly after all, and I was not yet free from the soiling consciousness of Mr. Wemmick's conservatory when I saw her face at the coach window, and her hand waving to me. What was the nameless shadow which again in that one instant had passed? Chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In her furred travelling dress, Estella seemed more delicately beautiful than she had ever seemed yet, even in my eyes. Her manner was more winning than she had cared to let it be to me before, and I thought I saw Miss Havisham's influence in the change. We stood in the inn yard while she pointed out her luggage to me, and when it was all collected I remembered, having forgotten everything but herself in the meanwhile, that I knew nothing of her destination. "I am going to Richmond," she told me. "Our lesson is that there are two Richmonds, one in Surrey and one in Yorkshire, and that mine is the Surrey Richmond. The distance is 10 miles. I am to have a carriage, and you are to take me. This is my purse, and you are to pay my charges out of it." "Oh, you must take the purse. We have no choice, you and I, but to obey our instructions. We are not free to follow our own devices, you and I." As she looked at me in giving me the purse, I hoped there was an inner meaning in her words. She said them slightingly, but not with displeasure. "A carriage will have to be sent for, Estella. Will you rest here a little?" "Yes, I am to rest here a little, and I am to drink some tea, and you are to take care of me the while." She drew her arm through mine, as if it must be done, and I requested a waiter, who had been staring at the coach like a man who had never seen such a thing in his life, to show us a private sitting room. Upon that he pulled out a napkin, as if it were a magic clue without which he couldn't find the way upstairs, and led us to the black hole of the establishment, fitted up with a diminishing mirror, quite a superfluous article considering the hole's proportions, an anchovy sauce cruet, and somebody's pattens. On my objecting to this retreat, he took us into another room with a dinner table for 30, and in the grate a scorched leaf of a copybook under a bushel of coal dust. Having looked at this extinct conflagration and shaken his head, he took my order, which proved to be merely some tea for the lady, sent him out of the room in a very low state of mind. I was, and I am, sensible that the air of this chamber, in its strong combination of stable with soup stock, might have led one to infer that the coaching department was not doing well, and that the enterprising proprietor was boiling down the horses for the refreshment department. Yet the room was all in all to me. Estella being in it, I thought that with her I could have been happy there for life. I was not at all happy there at the time, observe, and I knew it well. "Where are you going to at Richmond?" I asked Estella. "I am going to live," said she, "at a great expense with a lady there who has the power, or says she has, of taking me about and introducing me, and showing people to me, and showing me to people." "I suppose you will be glad of variety and admiration?" "Yes, I suppose so." She answered so carelessly that I said, "You speak of yourself as if you were someone else." "Where did you learn how I speak of others? Come, come," said Estella, smiling delightfully. "You must not expect me to go to school to you. I must talk in my own way. How do you thrive with Mr. Pocket?" "I live quite pleasantly there, at least." It appeared to me that I was losing a chance. "At least," repeated Estella. "Well, as pleasantly as I could anywhere away from you." "You silly boy," said Estella, quite composedly. "How can you talk such nonsense? Your friend Mr. Matthew, I believe, is superior to the rest of his family." "Very superior indeed. He is nobody's enemy." "Don't add but his own," interposed Estella, "for I hate that class of man. But he really is disinterested above small jealousy and spite, I have heard." "I am sure I have every reason to say so." "You have not every reason to say so of the rest of his people," said Estella, nodding at me with an expression of face
that was at once grave and rallying. For they beset Miss Havisham with reports and insinuations to your disadvantage. They watch you, misrepresent you, write letters about you, anonymous sometimes, and you are the torment and the occupation of their lives. You can scarcely realize to yourself the hatred these people feel for you. They do me no harm, I hope." Instead of answering, Estella burst out laughing. This was very singular to me, and I looked at her in considerable perplexity. When she left off, and she had not laughed languidly, but with real enjoyment, I said in my different way with her, "I hope I may suppose that you would not be amused if they did me any harm." "No, no, you may be sure of that," said Estella. "You may be certain that I laugh because they fail. Oh, those people with Miss Havisham, and the tortures they undergo!" She laughed again, and even now, when she had told me why, her laughter was very singular to me, for I could not doubt its being genuine, and yet it seemed too much for the occasion. I thought there must be really something more here than I knew. She saw the thought in my mind, and answered it. "It is not easy for even you," said Estella, "to know what satisfaction it gives me to see those people thwarted, or what an enjoyable sense of the ridiculous I have when they are made ridiculous. For you were not brought up in that strange house from a mere baby. I was. You had not your little wits sharpened by their intriguing against you, suppressed and defenceless, under the mask of sympathy and pity, and what not that is soft and soothing. I had. You did not gradually open your round childish eyes wider and wider to the discovery of that impostor of a woman who calculates her stores of peace of mind for when she wakes up in the night. I did." It was no laughing matter with Estella now, nor was she summoning those remembrances from any shallow place. I would not have been the cause of that look of hers for all my expectations in a heap. "Two things I can tell you," said Estella. "First, notwithstanding the proverb that constant dropping will wear away a stone, you may set your mind at rest that these people never will, never would, in 100 years, impair your ground with Miss Havisham, in any particular, great or small. Second, I am beholden to you as the cause of their being so busy and so mean in vain, and there is my hand upon it." She gave it to me playfully, for her darker mood had been but momentary. I held it and put it to my lips. "You ridiculous boy," said Estella, "will you never take warning, or do you kiss my hand in the same spirit in which I once let you kiss my cheek?" "What spirit was that?" said I. "I must think a moment. A spirit of contempt for the fawners and plotters." "If I say yes, may I kiss the cheek again?" "You should have asked before you touched the hand, but yes, if you like." I leaned down, and her calm face was like a statue's. "Now," said Estella, gliding away the instant I touched her cheek, "you are to take care that I have some tea, and you are to take me to Richmond." Her reverting to this tone, as if our association were forced upon us, and we were mere puppets, gave me pain. But everything in our intercourse did give me pain. Whatever her tone with me happened to be, I could put no trust in it, and build no hope on it, and yet I went on against trust and against hope. Why repeat it 1,000 times? So it always was. I rang for the tea, and the waiter, reappearing with his magic clue, brought in by degrees some 50 adjuncts to that refreshment, but of tea not a glimpse. A tea-board, cups and saucers, plates, knives and forks, including carvers, spoons various, salt-cellars, a meek little muffin confined with the utmost precaution under a strong iron cover, Moses in the bulrushes typified by a soft bit of butter in a quantity of parsley, a pale loaf with a powdered head, 2 proof impressions of the bars of the kitchen fireplace on triangular bits of bread, and ultimately a fat family urn, which the waiter staggered in with, expressing in his countenance burden and suffering. After a prolonged absence at this stage of the entertainment, he at length came back with a casket of precious appearance containing twigs. These I steeped in hot water, and so from the whole of these appliances extracted 1 cup of I don't know what for Estella. The bill paid, and the waiter remembered, and the ostler not forgotten, and the chambermaid taken into consideration, in a word, the whole house bribed into a state of contempt and animosity, and Estella's purse much lightened, we got into our post-coach and drove away. Turning into Cheapside and rattling up Newgate Street, we were soon under the walls of which I was so ashamed. "What place is that?" Estella asked me. I made a foolish pretence of not at first recognizing it, and then told her. As she looked at it and drew her head again, murmuring "wretches," I would not have confessed to my visit for any consideration. "Mr. Jaggers," said I, by way of putting it neatly on somebody else, "has a reputation of being more in the secrets of that dismal place than any man in London." "He is more in the secrets of every place, I think," said Estella, in a low voice. "You have been accustomed to see him often, I suppose?" "I have been accustomed to see him at uncertain intervals ever since I can remember, but I know him no better now than I did before I could speak plainly. What is your own experience of him? Do you advance with him?" "Once habituated to his distressful manner," said I have done very well." "Are you intimate?" "I have dined with him at his private house." "I fancy," said Estella, shrinking, "that must be a curious place." "It is a curious place." I should have been chary of discussing my guardian too freely, even with her, but I should have gone on with the subject so far as to describe the dinner in Gerrard Street, if we had not then come into a sudden glare of gas. It seemed, while it lasted, to be all alight, and alive with that inexplicable feeling that I had before, and when we were out of it I was as much dazed for a few moments as if I had been in lightning. So we fell into other talk, and it was principally about the way by which we were travelling, and about what parts of London lay on this side of it, and what on that. The great city was almost new to her, she told me, for she had never left Miss Havisham's neighbourhood until she had gone to France, and she had merely passed through London then in going and returning. I asked her if my guardian had any charge of her while she remained here. To that she emphatically said, "God forbid," and no more. It was impossible for me to avoid seeing that she cared to attract me, that she made herself winning, and would have won me even if the task had needed pains. Yet this made me none the happier, for even if she had not taken that tone of our being disposed of by others, I should have felt that she held my heart in her hand because she wilfully chose to do it, and not because it would have wrung any tenderness in her to crush it and throw it away. When we passed through Hammersmith, I showed her where Mr. Matthew Pocket lived, and said it was no great way from Richmond, and that I hoped I should see her sometimes. "Oh yes, you are to see me. You are to come when you think proper. You are to be mentioned to the family. Indeed, you are already mentioned." I inquired, was it a large household she was going to be a member of? "No, there are only two, mother and daughter. The mother is a lady of some station, though not averse to increasing her income. I wonder Miss Havisham could part with you again so soon." "It is a part of Miss Havisham's plans for me, Pip," said Estella with a sigh, as if she were tired. "I am to write to her constantly, and see her regularly, and report how I go on. I and the jewels, for they are nearly all mine now." It was the first time she had ever called me by my name. Of course she did so purposely, and knew that I should treasure it up. We came to Richmond all too soon, and our destination there was a house by the green, a staid old house, where the hoops and powder and patches, embroidered coats, rolled stockings, ruffles and swords had had their court days many a time. Some ancient trees before the house were still cut into fashions as formal and unnatural as the hoops and wigs and stiff skirts, but their own allotted places in the great procession of the dead were not far off, and they would soon drop into them and go the silent way of the rest. A bell with an old voice, which I dare say in its time had often said to the house, "Here is the green farthingale, here is the diamond-hilted sword, here are the shoes with red heels and the blue solitaire," sounded gravely in the moonlight, and two cherry-coloured maids came fluttering out to receive Estella. The doorway soon absorbed her boxes, and she gave me a hand and a smile, and said good night, and was absorbed likewise. And still I stood looking at the house, thinking how happy I should be if I lived there with her, and knowing that I never was happy with her, but always miserable. I got into the carriage to be taken back to Hammersmith, and I got in with a bad heartache. I got out with a worse heartache at our own door, and I found little Jane Pocket coming home from a little party, escorted by her little lover, and I envied her little lover, in spite of his being subject to Flopson. Mr. Pocket was out lecturing, for he was a most delightful lecturer on domestic economy, and his treatises on the management of children themes. But Mrs. Pocket was at home, and was in a little difficulty on account of the baby's having been accommodated with a needle case to keep him quiet during the unacceptable absence, with a relative in the Foot Guards, of Millers, and more needles were missing than it could be regarded as quite wholesome for a patient of such tender years to apply externally or to take as a tonic. Mr. Pocket, being justly celebrated for giving most excellent practical advice, and for having a clear and sound perception of things, and a highly judicious mind, I had some notion in my heartache of begging him to accept my confidence, but happening to look up at Mrs. Pocket as she sat reading her book of dignities after prescribing bed as a sovereign remedy for her baby, I thought, well, no, I wouldn't. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As I had grown accustomed to my expectations, I had insensibly begun to notice their effect upon myself and those around me. Their influence on my own character I disguised from my recognition as much as possible, but I knew very well that it was not all good. I lived in a state of chronic uneasiness respecting my behaviour to Joe. My conscience was not by any means comfortable about Biddy. When I woke up in the night, like Camilla, I used to think, with a weariness on my spirits, that I should have been happier and better if I had never seen Miss Havisham's face, and had risen to manhood, content to be partners with Joe in the honest old forge. Many a time of an evening, when I sat alone looking at the fire, I thought after all there was no fire like the forge fire and the kitchen fire at home. Yet Estella was so inseparable from all my restlessness and disquiet of mind, that I really fell into confusion as to the limits of my own part in its production. That is to say, supposing I had no expectations, and yet had Estella to think of, I could not make out to my satisfaction that I should have done much better. Now, concerning the influence of my position on others, I was in no such difficulty, and so I perceived, though dimly enough perhaps, that it was not beneficial to anybody, and above all that it was not beneficial to Herbert. My lavish habits led his easy nature into expenses that he could not afford, corrupted the simplicity of his life, and disturbed his peace with anxieties and regrets. I was not at all remorseful for having unwittingly set these other branches of the Pocket family to their poor arts they practised, because such littlenesses were their natural bent, and would have been evoked by anybody else if I had left them slumbering. But Herbert's was a very different case, and it often caused me a twinge to think that I had done him evil service in crowding his sparsely furnished chambers with incongruous upholstery work, and placing the canary-breasted Avenger at his disposal. So now, as an infallible way of making little ease great ease, I began to contract a quantity of debt. I could hardly begin, but Herbert must begin too, so he soon followed. At Startop's suggestion, we put ourselves down for election into a club called the Finches of the Grove, the object of which institution I have never divined. If it were not that the members should dine expensively once a fortnight, to quarrel amongst themselves as much as possible after dinner, and to cause 6 waiters to get drunk on the stairs. I know that these gratifying social ends were so invariably accomplished that Herbert and I understood nothing else to be referred to in the first standing toast of the society, which ran, "Gentlemen, may the present promotion of good feeling ever reign predominant among the Finches of the Grove." The Finches spent their money foolishly. The hotel we dined at was in Covent Garden, and the first Finch I saw when I had the honour of joining the Grove was Bentley Drummle,
at that time floundering about town in a cab of his own, and doing a great deal of damage to the posts at the street corners. Occasionally he shot himself out of his equipage head foremost over the apron, and I saw him on one occasion deliver himself at the door of the Grove in this unintentional way, like Coles. But here I anticipate a little, for I was not a Finch, and could not be, according to the sacred laws of the society, until I came of age. In my confidence in my own resources, I would willingly have taken Herbert's expenses on myself, but Herbert was proud, and I could make no such proposal to him. So he got into difficulties in every direction, and continued to look about him. When we gradually fell into keeping late hours and late company, I noticed that he looked about him with a desponding eye at breakfast time, that he began to look about him more hopefully about midday, that he drooped when he came to dinner, that he seemed to descry capital in the distance rather clearly after dinner, that he all but realized capital towards midnight, and that at about 2 o'clock in the morning he became so deeply despondent again as to talk of buying a rifle and going to America, with a general purpose of compelling buffaloes to make his fortune. I was usually at Hammersmith about half the week, and when I was at Hammersmith I haunted Richmond, whereof separately by and by. Herbert would often come to Hammersmith when I was there, and I think at those seasons his father would occasionally have some passing perception that the opening he was looking for had not appeared yet. But in the general tumbling up of the family, his tumbling out in life somewhere was a thing to transact itself somehow. In the meantime Mr. Pocket grew greyer, and tried oftener to lift himself out of his perplexities by the hair, while Mrs. Pocket tripped up the family with her footstool, read her book of dignities, lost her pocket handkerchief, told us about her grandpapa, and taught the young idea how to shoot by shooting it into bed whenever it attracted her notice. As I am now generalizing a period of my life with the object of clearing my way before me, I can scarcely do so better than by at once completing the description of our usual manners and customs at Barnard's Inn. We spent as much money as we could, and got as little for it as people could make up their minds to give us. We were always more or less miserable, and most of our acquaintance were in the same condition. There was a gay fiction among us that we were constantly enjoying ourselves, and a skeleton truth that we never did. To the best of my belief, our case was in the last aspect a rather common one. Every morning, with an air ever new, Herbert went into the city to look about him. I often paid him a visit in the dark back room, in which he consorted with an ink jar, a hat peg, a coal box, a string box, an almanac, a desk and stool, and a ruler, and I do not remember that I ever saw him do anything else but look about him. If we all did what we undertake to do, as faithfully as Herbert did, we might live in a republic of the virtues. He had nothing else to do, poor fellow, except at a certain hour of every afternoon go to Lloyd's, in observance of a ceremony of seeing his principal, I think. He never did anything else in connection with Lloyd's that I could find out, except come back again. When he felt his case unusually serious, and that he positively must find an opening, he would go on, change at a busy time, and walk in and out in a kind of gloomy country dance figure among the assembled magnates. For, says Herbert to me, coming home to dinner on one of those special occasions, I find the truth to be, Handel, that an opening won't come to one, but one must go to it. So I have been. If we had been less attached to one another, I think we must have hated one another regularly every morning. I detested the chambers beyond expression at that period of repentance, and could not endure the sight of the Avenger's livery, which had a more expensive and less remunerative appearance than at any other time in the 24 hours. As we got more and more into debt, breakfast became a hollower and hollower form, and being on one occasion at breakfast time threatened by letter with legal proceedings, not unwholly connected, as my local paper might put it, with jewellery, I went so far as to seize the Avenger by his blue collar and shake him off his feet, so that he was actually in the air like a booted Cupid, for presuming to suppose that we wanted a roll. At certain times, meaning at uncertain times, for they depended on our humour, I would say to Herbert, as if it were a remarkable discovery, "My dear Herbert, we're getting on badly." "My dear Handel," Herbert would say to me in all sincerity, "if you will believe me, those very words were on my lips by a strange coincidence." "Then, Herbert," I would respond, "let us look at our affairs. We have always derived profound satisfaction from making an appointment for this purpose. I always thought this was business. This was the way to confront the thing. This was the way to take the foe by the throat, and I knew that Herbert thought so too." We ordered something rather special for dinner, with a bottle of something similarly out of the common way, in order that our minds might be fortified for the occasion, and we might come well up to the mark. Dinner over, we produced a bundle of pens, a copious supply of ink, and a goodly show of writing and blotting paper, for there was something very comfortable in having plenty of stationery. I would then take a sheet of paper and write across the top of it, in a neat hand, the heading "Memorandum of Pip's Debts," with Barnard's Inn and the date very carefully added. Herbert would also take a sheet of paper and write across it with similar formalities, "Memorandum of Herbert's Debts." Each of us would then refer to a confused heap of papers at his side, which had been thrown into drawers, worn into holes in pockets, half burnt in lighting candles, and stuck for weeks into the looking-glass, and otherwise damaged. The sound of our pens going refreshed us exceedingly, insomuch that I sometimes found it difficult to distinguish between this edifying business proceeding and actually paying the money. In point of meritorious character, the two things seemed about equal. When we had written a little while, I would ask Herbert how he got on. Herbert probably would have been scratching his head in a most rueful manner at the sight of his accumulating figures. "They are mounting up, Handel," Herbert would say. "Upon my life, they are mounting up." "Be firm, Herbert," I would retort, plying my own pen with great assiduity. "Look the thing in the face. Look into your affairs. Stare them out of countenance." "So I would, Handel, only they are staring me out of countenance." However, my determined manner would have its effect, and Herbert would fall to work again. After a time he would give up once more, on the plea that he had not got Cobb's bill, or Lobb's, or Nobb's, as the case may be. "Then, Herbert, estimate it in round numbers, and put it down." "What a fellow of resource you are," my friend would reply with admiration. "Really, your business powers are very remarkable." I thought so too. I established with myself on these occasions the reputation of a first-rate man of business, prompt, decisive, energetic, clear, cool-headed. When I had got all my responsibilities down upon my list, I compared each with the bill and ticked it off. My self-approval when I ticked an entry was quite a luxurious sensation. When I had no more ticks to make, I folded all my bills up uniformly, docketed each on the back, and tied the whole into a symmetrical bundle. Then I did the same for Herbert, who modestly said he had not my administrative genius, and felt that I had brought his affairs into focus for him. My business habits had one other bright feature, which I called "leave a margin." For example, supposing Herbert's debts to be £164 4 and twopence, I would say, "Leave a margin and put them down at 200." Or supposing my own to be 4 times as much, I would leave a margin and put them down at 700. I had the highest opinion of the wisdom of this same margin, but I am bound to acknowledge that on looking back I deem it to have been an expensive device, for we always ran into new debt immediately to the full extent of the margin, and sometimes, in the sense of freedom and solvency it imparted, got pretty far on into another margin. But there was a calm, a rest, a virtuous hush, consequent on these examinations of our affairs, that gave me, for the time, an admirable opinion of myself. Soothed by my exertions, my method, and Herbert's compliments, I would sit with his symmetrical bundle and my own on the table before me among the stationery, and feel like a bank of some sorts, rather than a private individual. We shut our outer door on these solemn occasions, in order that we might not be interrupted. I had fallen into my serene state one evening, when we heard a letter drop through the slit in the said door, and fall to the ground. "It's for you, Handel," said Herbert, going out and coming back with it, "and I hope there is nothing the matter." This was in allusion to its heavy black seal and border. The letter was signed Trabb & Co., and its contents were simply that I was an honoured sir, and that they begged to inform me that Mrs. J. Gargery had departed this life on Monday last at 20 minutes past 6 in the evening, and that my attendance was requested at the interment on Monday next at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was the first time that a grave had opened in my road of life, and the gap it made in the smooth ground was wonderful. The figure of my sister in her chair by the kitchen fire haunted me night and day. That the place could possibly be without her was something my mind seemed unable to compass, and whereas she had seldom or never been in my thoughts of late, I had now the strangest ideas that she was coming towards me in the street, or that she would presently knock at the door, in my rooms too, with which she had never been at all associated. There was at once the blankness of death, and a perpetual suggestion of the sound of her voice, or the turn of her face or figure, as if she was still alive and had been there often. Whatever my fortunes might have been, I could scarcely have recalled my sister with much tenderness, but I suppose there is a shock of regret which may exist without much tenderness. Under its influence, and perhaps to make up for the want of the softer feeling, I was seized with a violent indignation against the assailant from whom she had suffered so much, and I felt that on sufficient proof I could have revengefully pursued Orlick or anyone else to the last extremity. Having written to Joe to offer him consolation, and to assure him that I would come to the funeral, I passed the intermediate days in the curious state of mind I have glanced at. I went down early in the morning, and alighted at the Blue Boar in good time to walk over to the forge. It was fine summer weather again, and as I walked along, the times when I was a little helpless creature, and my sister did not spare me, vividly returned. But they returned with a gentle tone upon them that softened even the edge of Tickler. For now the very breath of the beans and clover whispered to my heart that the day must come when it would be well for my memory that others walking in the sunshine should be softened as they thought of me. At last I came within sight of the house, and saw that Trabb and Co. had put in a funereal execution and had taken possession. Two dismally absurd persons, each ostentatiously exhibiting a crutch done up in a black bandage, as if that instrument could possibly communicate any comfort to anybody, were posted at the front door, and in one of them I recognised a postboy discharged from the Boar for turning a young couple into a saw-pit on their bridal morning, in consequence of intoxication rendering it necessary for him to ride his horse clasped round the neck with both arms. All the children of the village and most of the women were admiring these sable warders and the closed windows of the house and forge, and as I came up, one of the two warders, the postboy, knocked at the door, implying that I was far too much exhausted by grief to have strength remaining to knock for myself. Another sable warder, a carpenter who had once eaten 2 geese for a wager, opened the door and showed me into the best parlour. Here Mr. Trabb had taken unto himself the best table, and had got all the leaves up, and was holding a kind of black bazaar, with the aid of a quantity of black pins. At the moment of my arrival he had just finished putting somebody's hat into black long clothes like an African baby, so he held out his hand for mine. But I, misled by the action and confused by the occasion, shook hands with him with every testimony of warm affection. Poor dear Joe, entangled in a little black cloak tied in a large bow under his chin, was seated apart at the upper end of the room, where, as chief mourner, he had evidently been stationed by Trabb. When I bent down and said to him, "Dear Joe, how are you?" he said, "Pip, old chap, you knowed her when she were a fine figure of a—" and clasped my hand and said no more. Biddy, looking very neat and modest in her black dress, went quietly here and there, and was very helpful. When I had spoken to Biddy, as I thought it not a time for talking, I went and sat down near Joe, and there began to wonder in what part of the house she, my sister, was. The air of the parlour being faint with the smell of sweet cake, I looked about for the table of refreshments. It was scarcely visible until one had got accustomed to the gloom, but there was a cut-up plum-cake upon it, and there were cut-up oranges and sandwiches and biscuits, and 2 decanters that I knew very well as ornaments, but had never seen used in all my life, one full of port and one of sherry. Standing at this table, I became conscious of the servile Pumblechook, in a black cloak and several yards of hatband, who was alternately stuffing himself and making obsequious movements to catch my attention. The moment he succeeded, he came over to me, breathing sherry and crumbs, and said in a subdued voice, "May I, dear sir?" and did. Then described Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, the last named in a decent speechless paroxysm in a corner. We were all going to follow, and we were all in course of being tied up separately by Trabb into ridiculous bundles. "Which I mean to say, Pip," Joe whispered to me, as we were being what Mr. Trabb called formed in the parlour, 2 and 2, and it was dreadfully like a preparation for some grim kind of dance, "which I mean to say, sir, as I would in preference to have carried her to the church myself, along with 3 or 4 friendly ones what come to it with willing hearts and arms, but it were considered what the neighbours would look down on such, and would be of opinions as it were wanting in respect." "Pocket handkerchiefs out all," cried Mr. Trabb at this point, in a depressed business-like voice. "Pocket handkerchiefs out. We are ready." So we all put our pocket handkerchiefs to our faces, as if our noses were bleeding, and filed out 2 and 2, Joe and I, Biddy and Pumblechook, Mr. and Mrs. Hubble. The remains of my poor sister had been brought round by the kitchen door, and it being a point of undertaking ceremony that the 6 bearers must be stifled and blinded under a horrible black velvet housing with a white border, the whole looked like a blind monster with 12 human legs, shuffling and blundering along under the guidance of 2 keepers, the post-boy and his comrade. The neighbourhood, however, highly approved of these arrangements, and we were much admired as we went through the village, the more youthful and vigorous part of the community making dashes now and then to cut us off, and lying in wait to intercept us at points of vantage. At such times the more exuberant among them called out in an excited manner on our emergence round some corner of expectancy, "Here they come! Here they are!" and we were all but cheered. In this progress I was much annoyed by the abject Pumblechook, who, being behind me, persisted all the way as a delicate attention in arranging my streaming hatband and smoothing my cloak. My thoughts were further distracted by the excessive pride of Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, who were surpassingly conceited and vainglorious in being members of so distinguished a procession. And now the range of marshes lay clear before us, with the sails of the ships on the river growing out of it, and we went into the churchyard, close to the graves of my unknown parents, Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above. And there my sister was laid quietly in the earth, while the larks sang high above it, and the light winds strewed it with the beautiful shadows of clouds and trees. Of the conduct of the worldly-minded Pumblechook, while this was doing, I desire to say no more than it was all addressed to me, and that even when those noble passages were read which remind humanity of how it brought nothing into the world and could take nothing out, and how it fleeth like a shadow and never continueth long in one stay, I heard him cough a reservation of the case of a young gentleman who came unexpectedly into large property. When we got back, he had the hardihood to tell me that he wished my sister could have known I had done her so much honour, and to hint that she would have considered it reasonably purchased at the price of her death. After that he drank all the rest of the sherry, and Mr. Hubble drank the port, and the 2 talked, which I have since observed to be customary in such cases, as if they were of quite another race from the deceased, and were notoriously immortal. Finally he went away with Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, to make an evening of it, I felt sure, and to tell the jolly bargeman that he was the founder of my fortunes and my earliest benefactor. When they were all gone, and when Trabb and his men, but not his boy, I looked for him, had crammed their mummery into bags, and were gone too, the house felt wholesomer. Soon afterwards Biddy, Joe, and I had a cold dinner together, but we dined in the best parlour, not in the old kitchen, and Joe was so exceedingly particular what he did with his knife and fork, and the salt cellar, and what not, that there was great restraint upon us. But after dinner, when I made him take his pipe, and when I had loitered with him about the forge, and when we sat down together on the great block of stone outside it, we got on better. I noticed that after the funeral Joe changed his clothes, so far as to make a compromise between his Sunday dress and working dress, in which the dear fellow looked natural, and like the man he was. He was very much pleased by my asking if I might sleep in my own little room, and I was pleased too, for I felt that I had done rather a great thing in making the request. When the shadows of evening were closing in, I took an opportunity of going into the garden with Biddy for a little talk. "Biddy," said I think you might have written to me about these sad matters." "Do you, Mr. Pip?" said Biddy. "I should have written if I had thought that." "Don't suppose that I mean to be unkind, Biddy, when I say I consider that you ought to have thought that." "Do you, Mr. Pip?" She was so quiet, and had such an orderly, good, and pretty way with her, that I did not like the thought of making her cry again. After looking a little at her downcast eyes as she walked beside me, I gave up that point. "I suppose it would be difficult for you to remain here now, Biddy dear?" "Oh, I can't do so, Mr. Pip," said Biddy, in a tone of regret, but still of quiet conviction. "I have been speaking to Mrs. Hubble, and I am going to her to-morrow. I hope we shall be able to take some care of Mr. Gargery together until he settles down." "How are you going to live, Biddy? If you want any "How am I going to live?" repeated Biddy, striking in, with a momentary flush upon her face. "I'll tell you, Mr. Pip. I'm going to try to get the place of mistress in the new school nearly finished here. I can be well recommended by all the neighbours, and I hope I can be industrious and patient, and teach myself while I teach others. You know, Mr. Pip," pursued Biddy with a smile, as she raised her eyes to my face, "the new schools are not like the old, but I learnt a good deal from you after that time, and have had time since then to improve." "I think you would always improve, Biddy, under any circumstances." "Ah, except in my bad side of human nature," murmured Biddy. It was not so much a reproach as an irresistible thinking aloud. Well, I thought, I would give up that point too, so I walked a little further with Biddy, looking silently at her downcast eyes. "I have not heard the particulars of my sister's death, Biddy. They are very slight, poor thing. She had been in one of her bad states, though they had got better of late, rather than worse, for 4 days, when she came out of it in the evening, just at tea time, and said quite plainly, 'Joe,' as she had never said any word for a long while. I ran and fetched in Mr. Gargery from the forge. She made signs to me that she wanted him to sit down close to her, and wanted me to put her arms round his neck. So I put them round his neck, and she laid her head down on his shoulder, quite content and satisfied. And so she presently said, 'Joe,' again, and once 'Pardon,' and once 'Pip,' and so she never lifted her head up any more, and it was just an hour later when we laid it down on our own bed, because we found she was gone." Biddy cried. The darkening garden, and the lane, and the stars that were coming out, were blurred in my own sight. "Nothing was ever discovered, Biddy, nothing. Do you know what has become of Orlick? I should think from the colour of his clothes that he's working in the quarries. Of course you have seen him then. Why are you looking at that dark tree in the lane?" "I saw him there on the night she died." "That was not the last time either, Biddy." "No, I have seen him there since we have been walking here." "It's of no use," said Biddy, laying her hand upon my arm, as I was for running out. "You know I would not deceive you. He was not there a minute, and he is gone." I revived my utmost indignation to find that she was still pursued by this fellow, and I felt inveterate against him. I told her so, and told her that I would spend any money or take any pains to drive him out of that country. By degrees she led me into more temperate talk, and she told me how Joe loved me, and how Joe never complained of anything. She didn't say of me, she had no need, I knew what she meant, but ever did his duty in his way of life with a strong hand, a quiet tongue, and a gentle heart. Indeed, it would be hard to say too much for him, said I. And Biddy, we must often speak of these things, for of course I shall be often down here now. I'm not going to leave poor Joe alone. Biddy said never a single word. Biddy, don't you hear me? Yes, Mr. Pip. Not to mention your calling me Mr. Pip, which appears to me to be in bad taste. Biddy, what do you mean? What do I mean? Asked Biddy timidly. Biddy, said I, in a virtuously self-asserting manner, I must request to know what you mean by this. By this, said Biddy. Now don't echo, I retorted. You used not to echo, Biddy. Used not, said Biddy. Oh, Mr. Pip, used. Well, I rather thought I would give up that point too. After another silent turn in the garden, I fell back on the main position. Biddy, said I made a remark respecting my coming down here often to see Joe, which you received with a marked silence. Have the goodness, Biddy, to tell me why. Are you quite sure, then, that you will come to see him often? Asked Biddy, stopping in the narrow garden walk, and looking at me under the stars with a clear and honest eye. Oh, dear me, said I, as if I found myself compelled to give up Biddy in despair. This really is a very bad side of human nature. Don't say any more, if you please, Biddy. This shocks me very much. For which cogent reason I kept Biddy at a distance during supper, and when I went up to my own old little room, took as stately a leave of her as I could, in my murmuring soul, deem reconcilable with the churchyard and the event of the day. Often, as I was restless in the night, and that was every quarter of an hour, I reflected what an unkindness, what an injury, what an injustice Biddy had done me. Early in the morning I was to go. Early in the morning I was out and looking in, unseen, at one of the wooden windows of the forge. There I stood for minutes, looking at Joe, already at work, with a glow of health and strength upon his face that made it show as if the bright sun of the life in store for him was shining on it. Goodbye, dear Joe. No, don't wipe it off. For God's sake, give me your blackened hand. I shall be down soon and often. Never too soon, sir, said Joe, and never too often, Pip. Biddy was waiting for me at the kitchen door, with a mug of new milk and a crust of bread. Biddy, said I, when I gave her my hand at parting, I'm not angry, but I am hurt. No, don't be hurt, she pleaded quite pathetically. Let only me be hurt if I have been ungenerous. Once more the mists were rising as I walked away. If they disclosed to me, as I suspect they did, that I should not come back, and that Biddy was quite right, all I can say is, they were quite right too. End of chapter 35.